I'll never forget the moment my world shattered in front of 200 people. There I was, at my sister's lavish wedding reception, helping in the back, wearing my simple staff uniform, while guests in designer gowns sipped champagne. Then she grabbed the microphone. "Everyone, I have an announcement." Her voice cut through the celebration like a knife. "My sister here is fired, effective immediately." The entire ballroom went silent. 200 pairs of eyes turned to stare at me. My father laughed loudly from the head table. "Well, now we officially have an unemployed daughter." My mother wouldn't even look at me. I stood there, frozen tears burning my eyes, wanting the ground to swallow me whole. But then my phone buzzed. An unknown number. A deep, authoritative voice. "This is Chairman Mitchell. Put your sister on the phone. Now." The chairman, the highest authority in the entire company. My sister's face drained of color as she took my phone. Whatever he said made her knees buckle. She actually knelt down in her wedding dress in front of everyone, stammering, "Yes, sir. I understand, sir." The room exploded in whispers. Phones came out recording. Her new husband rushed over in panic. What I didn't know then was that this phone call would unravel everything. A multi-million-dollar fraud scheme, a revenge plot spanning 30 years, and a secret connection to my own mother that would bring a powerful man to his knees. My sister thought she destroyed me that night. She had no idea she'd just lit the fuse on her own empire's collapse. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 28 years old, and until tonight, I worked as a senior project coordinator at Henderson & Associates, a prestigious consulting firm where my older sister Rachel happens to be vice president of operations. I never expected my career or my life to implode at her wedding reception, but that's exactly what happened. The Crystal Ballroom at the Riverside Hotel was something out of a fairy tale. 3 enormous chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the 200 guests who represented the cream of our city's business elite. White orchids cascaded from every table centerpiece, and a 12-piece orchestra played softly in the corner, while waiters in crisp tuxedos glided between tables, carrying trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Rachel had spared no expense for her big day marrying Marcus Whitfield, the charismatic CEO of Henderson & Associates, and one of the most powerful men in the industry. I wasn't sitting with the guests. Instead, I was backstage in the service corridor wearing a simple black staff uniform that Rachel had specifically requested I put on. "We need someone to coordinate with the vendors," she'd told me 3 days before the wedding, her tone leaving no room for argument. "You're good at that sort of thing." So while everyone else wore designer gowns and tailored suits, I spent the evening making sure the cake arrived on time and the photographer knew where to stand. I told myself it didn't matter that I was helping my sister on her special day, but the truth was harder to swallow. Even at her own wedding, Rachel needed to make sure I knew my place. I was checking my watch. The speeches would start in 10 minutes when I heard the feedback screech from the microphone. The orchestra stopped mid-song. Conversations died away. I stepped out from behind the velvet curtain just in time to see Rachel standing at the podium, still in her stunning ivory gown, her face flushed with what I assumed was champagne and happiness. "Everyone, I have an announcement," she said, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent ballroom. Her eyes scanned the crowd until they landed on me standing awkwardly in my staff uniform near the side door. A strange smile played at her lips. "My sister here, Emily, is fired, effective immediately." The words hung in the air like smoke. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard her. But the sea of faces turning toward me, the confused expressions, the whispers already starting, they confirmed what my brain refused to accept. 200 people, including the most influential executives and socialites in the city, were staring at me as my sister publicly terminated my employment at her wedding reception. My father, sitting at the head table in his perfectly pressed tuxedo, recovered first. He let out a loud, forced laugh that echoed through the stunned silence. "Well," he called out, his voice carrying that jovial tone he used when he wanted everyone to think something was funny instead of horrifying, "now we officially have an unemployed daughter." Several people near him chuckled uncomfortably, unsure whether this was some kind of rehearsed entertainment. My mother sat beside him, her champagne glass frozen halfway to her lips. She didn't laugh. She didn't say anything. She just looked down at her plate, her perfectly coiffed hair hiding her face, and in that moment her silence hurt almost as much as Rachel's announcement. I couldn't breathe. The ballroom tilted and swayed around me. My hands started shaking and I felt tears burning hot behind my eyes. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. Not here. Not like this. Not in front of everyone who mattered in my professional world. I wanted to run, to disappear, to wake up from this nightmare. But my legs wouldn't move. I just stood there frozen, feeling the weight of 200 stares, hearing the whispers growing louder, watching my entire world collapse around me. Rachel was still at the microphone, looking pleased with herself. Marcus stood beside her now, his hand on her shoulder, his expression unreadable. The guests were buzzing with speculation, some craning their necks to get a better look at me. Others exchanging meaningful glances that said they'd be dining out on this story for months. Then my phone buzzed in my pocket. The vibration startled me out of my paralysis. With trembling hands, I pulled it out and looked at the screen. Unknown number. But I recognized the area code. It was the main line for Henderson & Associates corporate headquarters. My first thought was that this was someone from HR calling to make my humiliation official. My second thought was that I should let it go to voicemail. But something, instinct, desperation, or maybe just the need to escape the stares, made me swipe to answer. "Hello." My voice came out barely above a whisper. "This is Chairman Mitchell," said a deep, measured voice on the other end. "Put your sister on the phone. Now." Chairman Mitchell. The name hit me like a physical blow. Everyone in the company knew who he was. Theodore Mitchell, the board chairman of Henderson & Associates. The man who sat at the very top of the organizational chart above even Marcus. He was practically a legend, rarely seen in the offices conducting business from some distant executive suite that felt more mythical than real. I'd never spoken to him, never even seen him in person. And now he was on my phone at my sister's wedding, asking to speak to Rachel. My throat felt tight. Yes, sir. She's right here." The ballroom was still buzzing with uncomfortable energy, guests turning to their neighbors with raised eyebrows and hushed speculation. Rachel had stepped away from the microphone but remained near the podium, accepting congratulations from Marcus's business partners, who seemed eager to pretend the bizarre firing announcement had been some sort of avant-garde entertainment. She looked radiant, victorious, even her white dress catching the light from the chandeliers, as she laughed at something one of the guests said. I walked toward her on unsteady legs, weaving between tables, acutely aware that people were watching my every move. Some faces held pity, others curiosity, a few barely concealed amusement. By the time I reached Rachel, my heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. "Rachel," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "There's a phone call for you." She turned to me with an expression of mild annoyance, as if I were an interrupting waitress rather than her sister. "Emily, I'm in the middle of my reception. Whatever it is can wait." "It's Chairman Mitchell." I held out the phone, my hand still shaking. "He wants to speak with you. Now." The change in her face was instantaneous and dramatic. The confident smile vanished. Her eyes widened and all the color drained from her cheeks, leaving her makeup standing out stark against suddenly pale skin. She looked at the phone in my hand as if it were a snake, then back at my face, searching for some sign that I was joking. "What?" The word came out barely audible. "The chairman," I repeated, and this time several nearby guests heard me. A hush began spreading outward from where we stood, conversations dying mid-sentence as people sensed something significant was happening. "He's on the line. He asked for you specifically." Rachel's hand trembled as she took the phone from me. She held it to her ear, and I watched her face transform through a series of expressions. Confusion, recognition, then something close to fear. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice high and tight. Nothing like the confident tone she'd used at the microphone moments before. This is Rachel Whitfield." I couldn't hear what he was saying, but I could see its effect on my sister. Her free hand gripped the edge of a nearby table for support. Marcus appeared at her side, his brow furrowed with concern, but Rachel waved him away with a sharp gesture. The orchestra had stopped playing entirely now. The entire ballroom seemed to be holding its breath. "Yes, sir. I understand, sir." Rachel's voice grew quieter with each response, her usual commanding presence crumbling with every word. Her shoulders hunched forward slightly, a posture I'd never seen her take before. She'd always carried herself like she owned every room she walked into, but now she looked small, diminished. Then she glanced up at something behind me, and her face went even paler if that was possible. I turned to follow her gaze and saw high on the wall near the entrance a security camera with its small red light blinking steadily. Had it been recording this whole time? Had Chairman Mitchell somehow been watching the reception? "Of course, sir. Right away, sir." Rachel's voice had taken on a desperate quality now. She was nodding frantically even though he couldn't see her. Whatever he was saying had her completely rattled. The guests closest to us had abandoned all pretense of polite conversation. They were openly staring now, some leaning in to hear better, others whispering urgently to their companions. I saw Marcus's face growing redder by the second as he tried to understand what was happening. My father had risen from the head table and was making his way toward us. His expression caught between confusion and anger. Then something extraordinary happened. Rachel's knees buckled. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, as if the strength was simply draining out of her legs. She sank down first to a crouch, then to her knees right there on the polished ballroom floor, her expensive white dress pooling around her. Several women gasped. Marcus rushed forward, trying to help her up, but she shook her head violently, still clutching the phone to her ear. "I understand completely, sir," she whispered, and now her voice carried across the silent ballroom because everyone had stopped talking entirely. "It won't happen again. I promise you, sir, it won't happen again." I stood there frozen, watching my sister kneel in her wedding dress while speaking to the most powerful man in our company. The chairman's voice was loud enough now that I could hear the low rumble of it through the phone, though not the specific words. His tone was controlled but absolutely firm, carrying an authority that needed no volume to convey its weight. But there was something else in his voice, too. Something I couldn't quite identify. It wasn't just professional displeasure or corporate authority. There was an undertone of something deeper, something almost personal, as if this moment meant more to him than a simple breach of company protocol. Rachel was crying now, tears streaming down her carefully made-up face, leaving dark trails of mascara. She looked up at me, and for just a moment I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before. Genuine fear. The chairman must have said something else because Rachel's expression shifted again, this time to something closer to horror. "Yes, sir," she breathed. "I'll be there Monday morning. First thing. I promise." Then I heard it faint but distinct through the phone's speaker, the chairman's voice dropping to something quieter, almost contemplative, as if he were speaking to himself rather than to Rachel. "She looks just like her mother did." The words hung in the air like a question no one could answer. "She looks just like her mother did." I had no idea what the chairman meant, but there was no time to process it because his voice suddenly grew louder, projecting through the phone's speaker, with enough volume that the guests standing nearest to us could hear every word. "You've crossed a line, young lady." His tone was no longer controlled and measured. There was steel in it now, cold and sharp. "This is not how we treat employees, especially family." Rachel's entire body seemed to fold in on itself. She was already on her knees, but now she bent forward slightly, the phone pressed so hard against her ear that her knuckles had gone white. "I'm sorry, sir," she choked out, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean I wasn't thinking." "That much is evident." The chairman's voice carried clearly now to at least a dozen guests in our immediate vicinity. An elderly woman in diamonds clutched her husband's arm, her mouth forming a perfect O of shock. A younger couple exchanged wide-eyed glances, and I saw the man slowly reach into his jacket pocket. "What you did tonight was not only unprofessional, it was cruel. It was calculated public humiliation of a valued employee who happens to be your own sister. The whispers started, then a low wave of sound that rippled outward through the ballroom like a stone dropped in still water. Heads turned. People rose slightly from their seats to get a better view, and the murmur of speculation grew steadily louder. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was a scandal unfolding in real time, and everyone present knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. "Please, sir, if we could discuss this privately." Rachel's voice was desperate now, pleading in a way I'd never heard from her before. She'd always been the strong one, the successful one, the sister who had it all figured out. But now she looked utterly broken, mascara-streaked tears running down her face, her wedding dress bunched awkwardly around her knees. "You chose to make this public," the chairman interrupted, his voice cutting through her plea like a knife. "You announced her termination in front of 200 witnesses at a social event. You made it a spectacle, so now we deal with the consequences publicly." More phones came out now. I could see them around the room, held low and discreet, but unmistakably recording. The woman in diamonds had her phone pointed directly at Rachel. A group of younger guests near the bar had their devices out too, capturing every moment of my sister's humiliation. In tomorrow's social media feeds, this would be everywhere. The wedding that ended in disaster. The bride who got taken down by the boss. Marcus finally managed to push his way through the small crowd that had gathered. At 45, he usually commanded any room he entered with his silver-touched hair, expensive suit, and the easy confidence of a man who'd spent 20 years climbing to the top of the corporate ladder. But right now, he looked rattled, his composure cracking as he tried to understand what was happening to his wedding reception. He reached for Rachel's arm, attempting to help her, stand, his voice low and urgent. "Rachel, get up. Give me the phone." She shook her head violently, pulling away from him, keeping the phone pressed to her ear. "I can't," she whispered, though whether she was speaking to Marcus or to the chairman, I couldn't tell. Marcus's face flushed red. He turned his attention to me instead, as if this were somehow my fault. "Emily, what the hell is going on? Who's on that phone?" "Chairman Mitchell," I said quietly, and watched his expression shift from anger to something closer to alarm. "Theodore Mitchell." Marcus's voice came out strangled. He was the CEO of Henderson and Associates, but even he answered to the board, and Theodore Mitchell was the board's highest authority. Why would he be calling during... "Because he's been watching." The chairman's voice boomed through the speaker, loud enough now that half the ballroom could hear him. The remaining conversations died away completely. Even the waiters had stopped moving, frozen in place with their trays. "I've been watching this entire reception through your security feed, Mr. Whitfield, and what I witnessed tonight was unacceptable." Marcus's face went from red to pale in the span of a heartbeat. His eyes darted to the security camera mounted on the wall, the one Rachel had noticed earlier, then back to his bride kneeling on the floor. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. "Sir, I can explain," he finally managed. "You'll have your chance to explain on Monday morning," the chairman cut him off. 9 o'clock sharp, my office, both of you." There was a pause heavy with meaning, and then his voice dropped to something quieter, but no less powerful. "And you should know that what happened here tonight will have consequences. Serious consequences." The ballroom was completely silent now, except for the soft sound of Rachel's crying. 200 people sat or stood frozen witnesses to a moment that would be dissected and discussed for months to come. I could see my father standing halfway between the head table and where we stood, his face a mask of confusion and barely suppressed fury. My mother remained seated, but her hand covered her mouth, her eyes fixed on Rachel with an expression I couldn't read. Then the chairman's voice came through one final time, and this time it seemed to fill the entire space, echoing off the high ceilings and crystal chandeliers. This wedding just became a formal investigation. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my small apartment staring at my phone as it buzzed incessantly with notifications. The videos had started appearing on social media within an hour of the reception ending. Shaky phone footage of Rachel on her knees in her wedding dress. The audio distorted but clear enough to hear the chairman's voice cutting through the ballroom. By midnight, hashtags were trending. By 3 in the morning, my email inbox was flooded with messages from distant cousins, college friends, and former co-workers, all asking variations of the same question, what happened at your sister's wedding? The family group chat was the worst. It had started innocently enough years ago as a way for my parents, Rachel, me, and various aunts, uncles, and cousins to share holiday photos and birthday wishes. Now it was exploding with a fury I'd never witnessed before. Aunt Patricia, my father's older sister, sent a string of messages around 2 in the morning asking how I could embarrass the family like this at such an important event. Cousin Jennifer chimed in to say she'd seen the videos and couldn't believe I would cause such a scene. Uncle Robert, who'd always been Rachel's favorite, wrote that I owed everyone an apology for ruining what should have been a perfect day. I read every message, my stomach churning, but I didn't respond. What could I possibly say? That I hadn't caused the scene Rachel had. That I'd been the one humiliated, fired in front of 200 people. The family had already decided who was at fault, and it wasn't my sister. My mother called at 7 in the morning. I considered not answering, but years of ingrained obedience made me pick up on the third ring. Emily, her voice was tight, controlled. Your father and I need you to come to the house. Now. We're having a family meeting. Mom, I don't think... Now, Emily, this isn't a request. I arrived at my parents' house in the suburbs an hour later, still wearing the same clothes from the night before. My father's Mercedes was in the driveway, along with Rachel's car and Marcus's black BMW. So it would be all of us then. The whole family united against the one who dared to disrupt the perfect image we'd spent decades maintaining. They were waiting in the formal living room, the one my mother only used for important occasions. Rachel sat on the cream-colored sofa, her eyes red and swollen, still wearing what looked like yesterday's makeup. Marcus stood behind her, one hand on her shoulder, his expression grave. My parents occupied the matching armchairs positioned like judges at a tribunal. My father didn't waste time on pleasantries. Sit down, Emily. We need to discuss what happened last night and how we're going to fix this. I remained standing near the doorway. Fix what exactly? Don't be obtuse. His voice carried that sharp edge I remembered from childhood, the tone that meant I was in serious trouble. The spectacle at the wedding. The videos all over the internet, the gossip that's spreading through our entire social circle. He leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees. Do you have any idea what this is doing to our family's reputation? I didn't post those videos, I said quietly. I didn't fire myself in front of 200 people. My mother made a small sound of distress. Emily, please. Your sister made a mistake in the heat of the moment. You know how stressful weddings are, but bringing that phone call into it involving the chairman... I didn't involve him. I interrupted, my voice rising despite my best efforts to stay calm. He called me. I don't even know how he got my number. Rachel spoke for the first time, her voice hoarse. You must have contacted him somehow. Sent him some kind of complaint before the wedding. This doesn't just happen randomly. The accusation hung in the air between us. She genuinely believed I'd orchestrated this, that I'd somehow manipulated the most powerful man in our company into watching her wedding reception and intervening on my behalf. The absurdity of it would have been funny if it wasn't so painful. My father stood up, straightening his tie in that characteristic gesture that meant he was about to deliver a verdict. Here's what's going to happen. Emily, you're going to call Rachel and apologize. Publicly, if necessary. You're going to reach out to Chairman Mitchell and explain that this was all a misunderstanding, that there's no need for any investigation. You're going to help us contain this situation before it gets any worse. He paused, his eyes hard. This ends now. You apologize, we all move on, and we preserve what's left of this family's honor. I looked at each of them in turn. My father rigid with indignation, my mother unable to meet my eyes, Rachel dabbing at her tears with a tissue that Marcus handed her. Marcus himself watching me with barely concealed contempt. They wanted me to fall on my sword, to sacrifice whatever dignity I had left so they could maintain their perfect facade. No, I said simply. My father's face turned purple. "Excuse me." I said no. I won't apologize for something I didn't do. I won't lie to make this easier for everyone. I turned to leave, my hands shaking. If that makes me the villain in this story, so be it. I drove home through a haze of anger and grief, my phone still buzzing with family group chat messages demanding I reconsider. Instead of reading them, I opened my laptop and began typing. Every detail of the past 6 months at Henderson and Associates poured out the subtle ways Rachel had undermined my projects, the dismissive comments in meetings, the increasing hostility that I'd tried to ignore. I documented everything, attached relevant emails and performance reviews, and crafted a formal incident report describing the public termination and the hostile work environment that had preceded it. At 11:47 a.m., I sent it to HR with the subject line, "Formal complaint, wrongful termination, and workplace harassment." My finger hovered over the send button for only a moment before I clicked it. 3 minutes later, my inbox pinged. The sender was Jennifer Costa, Director of Human Resources. The subject line made my blood run cold, "Administrative leave, immediate action required." My hands trembled as I opened the email. Jennifer Costa's message was formal, precise, and utterly devoid of the warmth I'd come to associate with her over the years of company holiday parties and casual hallway conversations. The language was pure corporate protocol, each sentence carefully constructed to protect the company from liability while fundamentally altering the trajectory of my life. "Dear Ms. Carter." It began, and the use of my last name rather than my first felt like a slap. "In accordance with Henderson and Associates Employee Handbook Section 7.3 and applicable state employment law, you are hereby placed on temporary administrative leave with full pay effective immediately. This action is being taken pending the completion of a comprehensive investigation into allegations of workplace harassment and wrongful termination as detailed in your formal complaint dated today. During this period, you are not to contact any current employees regarding this matter, access company premises without prior authorization, or discuss the investigation publicly. You will be contacted within 72 hours regarding next steps. Please acknowledge receipt of this communication by replying to this email." I read it 3 times, each word sinking deeper into my consciousness. Administrative leave, investigation. Do not contact employees. The reality of what I'd set in motion crashed over me like a wave. This wasn't just about me and Rachel anymore. This was official, legal. There would be lawyers involved, formal depositions, potentially years of my life, consumed by corporate bureaucracy and legal procedures. The second paragraph made my stomach drop even further. Please be advised that Ms. Rachel Whitfield has also been placed on administrative leave pending this investigation in accordance with standard company policy regarding conflicts between employees at different management levels. Mr. Marcus Whitfield, as CEO and Ms. Whitfield's spouse, has recused himself from any involvement in this matter, and all investigative authority has been delegated to the board of directors. Rachel was on leave too. My sister, the vice president of operations, who'd spent the last 7 years building her career at Henderson and Associates, was now sitting at home just like me, waiting to see if everything she'd worked for would survive this investigation. Part of me felt a grim satisfaction at the thought. But another part, the part that remembered us as children building blanket forts and sharing secrets, felt something closer to sorrow. I typed a brief acknowledgement and hit send, then sat staring at my laptop screen until the words blurred together. My phone rang, startling me out of my daze. It was Helen Morrison, my friend from law school, who'd gone on to become a successful corporate attorney while I'd chosen the consulting path. We'd stayed close over the years, meeting monthly for coffee and occasional dinners. She was 15 years older than me, divorced, fiercely intelligent, and one of the few people I trusted completely. "I saw the videos," she said without preamble when I answered. "Tell me everything." We met an hour later at a small cafe 3 blocks from my apartment, far enough from Henderson and Associates' downtown offices that we wouldn't run into anyone from work. Helen arrived carrying her leather briefcase, her gray-streaked hair pulled back in its usual neat bun, her sharp eyes missing nothing as she studied my face across the small table. I told her everything, starting with the months of subtle hostility from Rachel, and ending with the HR email I'd received that morning. She listened without interrupting, occasionally jotting notes on a yellow legal pad she'd pulled from her briefcase. When I finished, she set down her pen and leaned back in her chair. "First things first," she said, her tone shifting into what I privately thought of as her lawyer voice. "You did the right thing filing that complaint. Don't let anyone make you doubt that. What your sister did was textbook workplace harassment, and the public nature of it makes it even worse from a legal standpoint." She paused to sip her coffee. "But now you need to be smart about how you handle this. These investigations can go sideways fast, especially when family dynamics are involved." "What do you mean?" "I mean that corporations don't like messiness, Emily. They'll want this resolved quickly and quietly. Your sister is a VP married to the CEO. You're a project coordinator. On paper, you're the expendable one." She held up a hand when I started to protest. "I'm not saying that's right. I'm saying that's the reality you're facing. So you need to be absolutely meticulous about documentation." She pulled a fresh page from her legal pad and started writing. "Keep every record, every text message, every email, every performance review. Save them in multiple places: your personal laptop, a cloud service, a physical backup drive. Document every conversation related to this matter with date, time, and participants. If someone calls you, follow up with an email summarizing what was discussed." She looked up at me, her expression serious. "And this is crucial. Keep your emotions out of the paper trail. Everything you write should be factual, specific, and professional. No angry rants, no personal attacks, no speculation about motives, just facts." I nodded, feeling overwhelmed, but also oddly grateful to have concrete actions to take. "What about my family? They're demanding I apologize and drop this whole thing." Helen's jaw tightened. "Your family doesn't get a vote. This is between you, your employer, and the legal system now. Don't let them guilt you into compromising your rights." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand briefly. "I know this is hard, especially with your sister involved, but you need to protect yourself first." We talked for another hour, Helen walking me through potential scenarios and outcomes. By the time we parted ways, I felt steadier, more prepared for whatever was coming. I spent the rest of Saturday afternoon organizing my files, creating the backup systems Helen had recommended, and writing down every detail I could remember about the past 6 months. Sunday morning brought another email, this time from an address I didn't recognize: mharrison@hendersonassociates. Margaret Harrison, according to her signature block, was executive assistant to Chairman Theodore Mitchell. The email was brief, but carried an unmistakable weight of importance. "Ms. Carter, Chairman Mitchell requests a private meeting with you Monday morning at 9:00 a.m. at corporate headquarters conference room A on the executive floor. Please confirm your attendance. This meeting is separate from the formal HR investigation and is being conducted at the chairman's personal discretion. Dress is business professional. Sincerely, Margaret Harrison." I read it twice, trying to decode the subtext. A private meeting with the chairman separate from the investigation. What could he possibly want to discuss that wasn't part of the official process? I replied, confirming my attendance, then spent the next hour second-guessing my decision. Monday morning at 7, another email arrived from Margaret Harrison. This one contained an attachment, a formal letter on Henderson and Associates letterhead signed by Theodore Mitchell himself. The letter reiterated the meeting time and location, but it was the final paragraph that made my blood run cold. "Please bring any documentation you have regarding Project X and vendor relationships. The chairman has questions that only you can answer." Project X. The name alone sent a chill through me. I'd worked on Project X for 8 months last year, coordinating vendor relationships for what was supposed to be a major technology infrastructure upgrade. It had been one of my largest assignments, involving dozens of contractors and a budget that ran into 7 figures. But the mention of it in the chairman's letter felt ominous, as if there was something about that project I should have seen, but hadn't. I arrived at Henderson and Associates headquarters 15 minutes early Monday morning, dressed in my most professional navy suit. The building felt different now that I was on administrative leave, as if I were trespassing in a space that no longer belonged to me. The security guard who normally waved me through with a friendly smile checked my ID carefully and made a phone call before issuing me a visitor's badge. The elevator ride to the executive floor, a level I'd only visited twice in my entire career, felt like ascending to another world entirely. Margaret Harrison met me as the elevator doors opened. She was in her early 60s, impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit, her silver hair styled in a sleek bob. Her smile was professional, but not unkind. "Ms. Carter, right this way, please. The chairman is expecting you." The executive floor was hushed, carpeted in deep burgundy, the walls lined with portraits of past company leaders dating back to Henderson and Associates' founding in 1947. We walked past several closed office doors until Margaret stopped at a set of double doors made of rich mahogany. She knocked twice, then opened them. "Ms. Carter, sir?" "Thank you, Margaret. Please hold my calls." Chairman Theodore Mitchell's office was exactly what I'd imagined a seat of corporate power would look like. Dark wood paneling covered the walls, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves held leather-bound volumes of corporate law and business history, and a massive desk dominated the center of the room. But what struck me most was the man himself. I'd expected someone intimidating cold, the kind of executive who wielded authority like a weapon. Instead, Theodore Mitchell rose from behind his desk with a warm smile, extending his hand across the polished surface. "Ms. Carter, thank you for coming. Please sit down." He gestured to one of two leather chairs positioned in front of his desk. "Can I offer you coffee?" "T. Margaret makes an excellent pot of both." "Coffee would be wonderful, thank you." My voice came out steadier than I felt. He pressed a button on his phone, and within moments Margaret appeared with a silver tray bearing 2 cups of coffee cream and sugar. The chairman prepared his own coffee with practiced ease, then settled back in his chair, studying me with eyes that were sharp but not unkind. He looked to be in his mid-70s with white hair and the kind of lined face that suggested a lifetime of difficult decisions made with careful consideration. "I imagine you're wondering why I asked you here." He began, his voice carrying that same measured quality I'd heard on the phone at the wedding. "Let me be direct. What happened at your sister's reception was unacceptable, and I want you to know that the board takes these matters very seriously. But that's not the only reason I wanted to speak with you privately." He opened a folder on his desk and removed several documents, spreading them out where I could see them. "I'd like to ask you some questions about Project X, specifically about the vendor relationships you managed during that initiative." My stomach tightened. "Of course. I'll help however I can." "Good." He slid the first document toward me. It was an invoice from a company called Apex Solutions Group for consulting services rendered. The amount was $127,000, and Rachel's signature appeared at the bottom as the approving authority. "Do you remember this vendor?" I studied the invoice, searching my memory. The name sounds familiar, but I don't recall working with them directly. Most of my vendor coordination involved the technology contractors and equipment suppliers. That's what I suspected. He produced another invoice, this one for $89,000 from a company called Summit Technologies. Again, Rachel's signature. "What about this one?" "No, I don't recognize that company either." A cold feeling was spreading through my chest. "Chairman Mitchell, what exactly are you asking me?" He leaned forward, his expression growing more serious. "I'm asking whether you were aware that over the course of Project X, approximately $1.8 million was paid to various consulting firms for services that, as far as I can determine, were never actually rendered. I'm asking whether you noticed that invoices were being approved for deliverables that don't appear to exist in any project documentation." The words hit me like a physical blow. No. I had no idea. My role was coordinating the legitimate vendors managing schedules and deliverables. I never saw these invoices. "I believe you." His voice was gentle, almost paternal. "In fact, I pulled your email records. You flagged several discrepancies in the project budget last spring, didn't you?" Sent concerns to your direct supervisor about expenses that didn't match your vendor contracts. I remembered that email, remembered the frustration I'd felt when it seemed to disappear into a void. Yes, but I never got a response. I assumed the accounting department had handled it. Your email was blocked from sending. Someone with administrative access deleted it from the server. He paused, letting that sink in. Someone who didn't want you asking questions about where that money was really going. My hands felt cold, despite the warm coffee cup I was holding. You think Rachel was involved in fraud? I think your sister's signatures appear on a great many questionable documents. Whether she knew what she was signing or was being manipulated by someone else remains to be seen. He studied me carefully. Tell me, Emily, what do you know about how your brother-in-law came to be CEO of this company? The question caught me off guard. I know he was hired about 2 years ago, that he had an impressive resume from his previous positions. Did you know that your father introduced Marcus to several members of our board at a charity gala? The chairman's tone was casual, but his eyes watched my reaction carefully. The Spring Arts Foundation benefit, to be precise. Your father was quite enthusiastic about Marcus's qualifications, spoke very highly of him to board members who trusted your father's judgment. I hadn't known that. My father had never mentioned it, though it made a certain sense. My father prided himself on his connections, on moving in circles of influence and power. No, I didn't know that. I wonder, the chairman said softly, if your father knew what kind of businessman Marcus Whitfield really was, if he had any idea what he was recommending to us. Before I could respond, he reached into his folder one more time and withdrew a photograph. It was old, the colors slightly faded in that way that marked it as being from decades ago. He slid it across the desk toward me. The photograph showed a group of men in suits standing in what looked like a corporate office circa 1990s, based on their clothing and hairstyles. I didn't recognize most of them, but one face stood out, a younger version of a man who bore a striking resemblance to Marcus. In the corner of the photo, partially obscured by the men in the foreground, stood a young woman in a business suit. Her dark hair pulled back, her face turned slightly away from the camera. She looked exactly like my mother. I stared at the photograph, my mind racing to make connections I didn't want to make. That's my mother, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But I don't understand. What does she have to do with any of this? The chairman's expression was carefully neutral. That's a conversation for another time. What matters now is that you understand the full picture of what you're facing. He pulled the photograph back, returning it to his folder. Your family has deep connections to this story, Emily. Connections they may not even fully understand themselves. I left his office an hour later with more questions than answers, my head spinning with implications of fraud, old photographs, and the unsettling realization that my family's entanglement with Marcus Whitfield went far deeper than I'd imagined. But it was during the drive home, sitting in traffic on the interstate, that a memory surfaced with sudden, uncomfortable clarity. It had been 2 years ago, spring of 2023. I remembered because it was right after my 26th birthday. My father had called me on a Thursday evening, his voice brimming with excitement, asking if I'd be free that weekend to attend the Spring Arts Foundation benefit gala. It's important, he'd said. I want you and Rachel there. I'm introducing Rachel to someone who could be very significant for her future. I'd declined, claiming a work deadline I needed to meet. The truth was, I'd never enjoyed those events, the endless small talk with people who measured your worth by your job title and your connections. But Rachel had gone, of course. Rachel always went. She understood the game my father played, the careful cultivation of relationships with powerful people, the networking that he believed was the key to success in life. I remember her calling me the next day, her voice animated in a way I hadn't heard in months. I met someone last night. Dad introduced us. He's incredible, CEO of Henderson & Associates, Harvard MBA, sits on 3 different boards. And he's interested in me. Can you believe it? I'd been happy for her, then genuinely happy. My sister was 33, had been through a difficult breakup the year before, and seemed to have given up on finding someone. The fact that this man was accomplished and successful had seemed like a bonus, not a warning sign. But now, sitting in my car as the traffic inched forward, I could hear my father's voice from that spring evening with new ears. Someone who could be very significant for her future. Not someone you might really like, or someone I think you'd enjoy meeting. No, my father had approached Rachel's introduction to Marcus like a business transaction, a strategic match that would elevate our family's status. And it had worked, hadn't it? Within 6 months, Rachel and Marcus were engaged. My father had thrown an engagement party that cost more than most weddings, inviting everyone who mattered in his social circle. I remembered standing in the corner of the country club ballroom, watching my father hold court with Marcus at his side, the two of them surrounded by admirers. My father had told the story of their introduction at least a dozen times that night, each retelling making his role more central, more instrumental. "I saw the potential immediately," he'd said to a group of his golf buddies while I stood nearby with a glass of champagne I wasn't drinking. Marcus Whitfield, CEO of one of the most prestigious firms in the state, and my daughter Rachel, brilliant and beautiful. I knew they'd be perfect for each other. When you have an eye for these things, when you understand how the world really works, you can see the right matches before anyone else does. His friends had congratulated him as if he'd brokered a merger rather than introduced two people at a party. And my father had glowed with pride, his chest literally puffing out as he basked in their approval. This wasn't just about Rachel finding happiness. This was about Richard Carter, successful businessman and social climber, proving once again that he had the connections and the insight to place his daughter with someone of Marcus's caliber. The wedding had been even worse. My father had spared no expense insisting on the crystal ballroom, the 12-piece orchestra, the designer flowers. "Only the best for my daughter and my son-in-law," he'd declared, but the subtext was clear. Only the best to show everyone what kind of family we were, what kind of connections we had, what level of society we'd achieved. And my mother had gone along with it all as she always did. She'd been quieter about it than my father, but I'd seen the way she looked at Marcus with something approaching reverence. Here was a man who came from money, who moved in circles they'd spent their whole lives trying to access. He represented everything they'd worked for, everything they believed success should look like. That's why they couldn't see him clearly. That's why even now, with videos of Rachel kneeling in her wedding dress circulating on social media, with the chairman himself raising questions about Marcus's business practices, my parents were still demanding that I apologize and make this all go away. Because to admit that Marcus Whitfield was anything less than the perfect son-in-law would be to admit that my father's judgment had failed, that his carefully cultivated connections had led him astray, that his proudest achievement was built on sand. My father's entire identity was wrapped up in this match. He'd introduced Marcus to board members, vouched for his character, bragged about the connection to everyone who mattered in his world. If Marcus turned out to be corrupt, if this marriage fell apart, if the brilliant CEO was actually a fraud, then what did that say about Richard Carter's ability to read people? What did it say about his vaunted connections and his supposed business acumen? It would mean he'd been played. Worse, it would mean everyone in his social circle would know he'd been played. The man who prided himself on understanding how the world worked, on seeing opportunities others missed, had failed to see the truth about the person he'd personally recommended to the board of a major corporation. No wonder he was so desperate for me to drop this investigation. No wonder he'd demanded I apologize, make peace, sweep everything under the rug. It wasn't really about protecting Rachel at all. And that was the first time I wondered, was Dad protecting his daughter or protecting his own reputation? That realization sat heavy in my chest as I pulled into my apartment parking lot. My father wasn't defending Rachel out of parental love or loyalty. He was defending his own carefully constructed image, the reputation he'd spent decades building in country clubs and charity galas and boardrooms. I was threatening to tear down everything he'd worked for, and he would fight me tooth and nail to prevent that. But the chairman's questions about Project X had planted a seed of doubt that I couldn't ignore. If there really had been fraudulent payments, if Rachel's signatures appeared on questionable invoices, then I needed to understand what had happened. Not just for the investigation, but for my own peace of mind. I spent the rest of Monday afternoon doing what Helen had advised, organizing my documentation. I logged into my personal laptop and accessed my work email through the company's remote portal, a system that allowed employees on leave to retrieve necessary files. I started with the most recent messages and worked backwards, searching for anything related to Project X vendor payments or budget discrepancies. It was tedious work scrolling through hundreds of emails about meeting schedules, project updates, and routine correspondence. But then, buried in my drafts folder from 6 months ago, I found something that made my blood run cold. The email was dated April 15th, addressed to both Marcus Whitfield and Rachel Carter Whitfield. The subject line read, "Project X budget concerns, urgent review needed." I didn't remember writing it, but as I read through the content, fragments of memory came back. It had been late on a Friday afternoon, and I'd been reviewing quarterly expense reports when I noticed something odd. "Dear Mr. Whitfield and Rachel," the draft began. "I've identified several concerning discrepancies in the Project X vendor payments that require immediate attention. Specifically, I've found invoices totaling approximately $847,000 from consulting firms that don't appear in any of my vendor coordination records. These companies, Apex Solutions Group, Summit Technologies, and Meridian Consulting Partners, were supposedly providing services related to our technology infrastructure upgrade, but I have no contracts, no deliverables, and no communication history with any of them. Additionally, the invoice amounts don't correspond to any line items in the approved project budget. I believe we need to conduct an audit of these payments before processing any further vendor invoices. Please advise on how you'd like me to proceed." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. I had seen this. I had noticed the problems. I had tried to raise the alarm, but the email had never been sent. At the bottom of the draft in red text was a notation I'd never seen before. "Blocked from sending administrative override 04/15/2024-1743. My hands shook as I clicked on the email properties, trying to understand what had happened. The metadata showed that the draft had been created at 5:27 p.m. on April 15th and had been modified at 5:43 p.m. by a user identified only as System. But there was another line in the properties that caught my attention. Access log R Whitfield deleted draft 04/15/2024-1802. Rachel had deleted my email. Or someone using Rachel's credentials had. They'd blocked it from sending, then removed it from my drafts folder. The only reason I could see it now was because Henderson and Associates' IT system kept shadow copies of all deleted items for legal compliance purposes. Copies that most employees didn't even know existed. I took screenshots of everything, the email, the metadata, the access logs, and saved them to 3 different locations, just as Helen had instructed. This was evidence of a cover-up, digital fingerprints, showing that someone had actively prevented me from reporting suspicious activity. But who had the technical knowledge to block an email from sending, and who had access to Rachel's login credentials? The questions multiplied faster than I could process them. I was still staring at my laptop screen when my personal email pinged with a new message. The sender was Frank Morrison at hendersonassociates.com. Frank Morrison was a veteran accountant in the finance department, a quiet man in his early 60s who'd been with the company for over 30 years. We'd worked together occasionally on budget reconciliations, and I'd always found him thorough and professional, if somewhat reserved. His email was brief, sent from what appeared to be a personal account rather than his work email. "Emily, I heard about what happened at the wedding. I'm sorry. I also heard there's an investigation starting. There's something you should know. Check invoice 1187 from last fiscal year. Not what it seems. Be careful they're watching who asks questions. This email never happened. F." My mouth went dry. Frank was taking a significant risk, reaching out to me like this, using his personal email, warning me to be careful. Whatever invoice 1187 was, it had to be important enough that he was willing to potentially jeopardize his own position to make sure I knew about it. I pulled up the company's vendor payment database, which I still had read-only access to despite being on administrative leave. I searched for invoice 1187, my fingers clumsy on the keyboard. The search results loaded slowly, and when they finally appeared, I had to read the entry 3 times before I could fully process what I was seeing. Invoice 1187, dated June 2024, was listed as a payment to Grandview Floral Design for executive office flowers and event decoration. The amount was $500,000. $500,000 for flowers. My first thought was that it had to be a typo, that someone had accidentally added an extra zero. But when I clicked through to view the full invoice details, I saw Rachel's signature on the approval form, along with a notation that the payment had been processed and the check cleared on June 28th. I ran a quick internet search for Grandview Floral Design. Nothing came up. No website, no business listings, no social media presence. I tried variations of the name, checked the business registry for our state, even looked for any florists with similar names. The company didn't exist. Invoice 1187 wasn't for office flowers. It was a $500,000 payment to a company that didn't exist. I sat frozen at my laptop staring at invoice 1187 until the numbers blurred together. $500,000 paid to a non-existent company approved by my sister, processed through Henderson and Associates accounting system as if it were perfectly legitimate. This wasn't a mistake or an oversight. This was deliberate fraud, and Frank had risked his job to make sure I knew about it. I forwarded all the documentation to Helen immediately, the blocked email, the access logs showing Rachel's credentials, and the details of invoice 1187. Within an hour, she called me back, her voice tight with concern. "Emily, this is bigger than workplace harassment. If what you're showing me is accurate, we're looking at systematic financial fraud. You need to get everything you have to the chairman immediately." I did exactly that, sending a comprehensive email to Margaret Harrison with all my findings attached. Her response came within minutes. "Received. The chairman has been briefed. Expect developments soon." Those developments came faster than I anticipated. By Wednesday morning, Henderson and Associates headquarters was buzzing with news that an independent forensic audit had been ordered. I learned about it from a brief formal email sent to all employees from the board of directors announcing that the firm of Castell & Munro, a nationally recognized forensic accounting company, would be conducting a comprehensive review of company finances. The email was carefully worded, mentioning nothing about fraud or specific concerns, only stating that the audit was being conducted as part of the board's ongoing commitment to financial transparency and corporate governance. But anyone who'd been paying attention to the wedding incident and the subsequent administrative leaves knew exactly what this meant. Margaret Harrison called me Thursday afternoon with an unexpected request. "Ms. Carter, the audit team would like to interview you. Would you be available to come to headquarters tomorrow at 10? I arrived Friday morning to find Conference Room B transformed into what looked like a forensic investigation headquarters. 3 auditors from Castell & Munro had taken over the space, their laptops and file boxes covering every surface. The lead auditor was a woman named Patricia Chen, mid-40s, with sharp eyes and an air of absolute professionalism. She shook my hand firmly and gestured to a chair across from where she'd set up her workspace. "Ms. Carter, thank you for coming in. We've been reviewing the documentation you provided to the chairman. Your attention to detail has been extremely helpful." She opened a laptop and pulled up a spreadsheet that made my head spin with its complexity. "We'd like to walk through your involvement with Project X from the beginning. Every vendor you coordinated, every invoice you processed, every budget meeting you attended." For the next 3 hours, I answered questions, providing context for payments, explaining workflow processes, identifying which vendors I'd worked with directly and which I'd never heard of. Patricia and her team took meticulous notes, occasionally conferring in low voices, their expressions revealing nothing. "One more question," Patricia said as our session wound down. "Did you ever feel pressured to approve payments without proper documentation? Or discouraged from asking questions about budget discrepancies?" I thought about that blocked email about the silence that had followed my attempts to raise concerns. Not overtly pressured, but when I tried to flag issues, my questions seemed to disappear into a void. I assumed I was being overly cautious that someone above my level had already addressed the concerns. Patricia exchanged a meaningful look with one of her colleagues. That's a common pattern in these situations. Thank you, Ms. Carter. We'll be in touch if we need anything further. As I was leaving the conference room, I nearly collided with Jennifer Costa from HR in the hallway. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. "Emily," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure we were alone. "Can we talk privately?" We found an empty office 2 doors down. Jennifer closed the door and leaned against it, her professional composure cracking slightly. "I need to tell you something, and this conversation is off the record. What I'm about to say could cost me my job, but you deserve to know." My pulse quickened. Okay. 3 weeks ago, Marcus called me into his office. He had a document prepared, a formal performance improvement plan for you. It detailed supposed issues with your work quality, missed deadlines, conflicts with colleagues. None of it was true. I'd reviewed your actual performance records. You were one of our strongest coordinators. She rubbed her temples, the stress evident in every line of her face. He wanted me to put it in your file and begin a formal disciplinary process. When I refused, when I told him the documentation didn't support those claims, he became very angry. He said I was being insubordinate, that he expected HR to support management decisions, not question them. What happened then? He went to Rachel. 2 days later, she submitted a separate memo to your personnel file claiming you'd made errors on Project X that had cost the company money. She provided specific examples, but when I tried to verify them, I couldn't find any evidence to support her claims. It was as if she'd fabricated incidents out of thin air. Jennifer met my eyes, her expression pained. "I think they were building a case to fire you, Emily. Building it carefully, methodically, with documentation that would hold up if you tried to fight it. The wedding announcement that wasn't impulsive. That was them jumping the gun on a termination they'd been planning for weeks." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. This hadn't been about Rachel losing her temper at her wedding. This had been calculated retaliation, a preemptive strike to get rid of me before I could uncover something they desperately wanted to keep hidden. I shared Jennifer's information with Helen that evening over the phone. There was a long silence after I finished, and when Helen finally spoke, her voice was grim. "Emily, if this fraud is as extensive as it's looking, this isn't just a corporate matter anymore. The amounts you're describing, the systematic nature of it, this could reach the SEC. We could be talking about a federal investigation." The words sent a chill through me. Securities and Exchange Commission. Federal charges. This was spiraling into territory I'd never imagined when I'd filed that initial HR complaint. Saturday morning, I was making coffee when my phone rang. Margaret Harrison's number appeared on the screen. "Ms. Carter, the Board of Directors has requested your presence at a special session tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. at headquarters. The chairman wanted me to tell you personally, come prepared to tell your story. The full board needs to hear it directly from you." I barely slept that night. The thought of facing the entire board of directors, of telling my story to 12 of the most powerful executives in the company, filled me with a dread I couldn't shake. Helen had coached me over the phone until nearly midnight, reminding me to stick to facts, to stay calm, to remember that the truth was my strongest weapon. But as I stood outside the boardroom Sunday morning at 8:55, wearing my best suit and clutching a folder of documentation, I felt like I was about to walk into a lion's den. Margaret Harrison met me at the door, her expression kind but unreadable. "They're ready for you, Ms. Carter. Just tell them what happened exactly as you experienced it. The chairman has already reviewed your documentation with them, but they want to hear it in your own words." The boardroom was more intimidating than I'd imagined. A massive oval table dominated the center, surrounded by leather chairs occupied by 12 people who collectively controlled billions of dollars in assets and thousands of jobs. Most were in their 60s and 70s, their faces weathered by decades of making difficult decisions. Chairman Mitchell sat at the head of the table and he gestured to an empty chair positioned slightly apart from the others facing the full board like a witness stand. "Ms. Carter, thank you for coming." His voice was formal but not unkind. "Please sit down. We have some questions for you." I took my seat, acutely aware of 12 pairs of eyes studying me. A silver-haired woman to the chairman's left spoke first, her voice crisp and direct. "Ms. Carter, we've reviewed the documentation you've provided regarding fraudulent invoices and your sister's involvement in approving questionable payments. Before we proceed, I need to understand your motivations. This is your sister we're discussing. Your family. Why are you pursuing this investigation?" The question hung in the air heavier than it seemed. I took a breath, choosing my words carefully. Because it's the right thing to do. Because employees at this company deserve to work in a place where the rules apply to everyone, not just to people without connections. A man across the table leaned forward, his expression skeptical. "That's a very noble answer. But let's be honest about what's happening here. Your sister publicly humiliated you at her wedding. Your parents have sided with her. You're essentially destroying your family relationships by coming forward with these allegations. Some might say this looks less like corporate integrity and more like personal revenge." The accusation stung, but I'd expected it. Helen had warned me this question would come. "I understand how it might look that way," I said, keeping my voice steady. "And I won't pretend that what happened at the wedding didn't hurt. It did, deeply. But I found evidence of fraud weeks before that wedding ever happened. I tried to report suspicious payments 6 months ago and my email was blocked. If this was about revenge, I would have gone to the media, not to HR and the chairman. I would have wanted maximum public embarrassment, not a proper internal investigation." Another board member, a distinguished man with a salt and pepper beard, spoke up. "Let me ask you directly then. Are you doing this for justice or for revenge?" I met his eyes, and in that moment I knew this was the question that mattered most. My answer would determine whether they saw me as a credible whistleblower or a vindictive family member settling scores. I'm doing this because if I stay silent, he'll do it to someone else. My sister made her choices, I can't control that. And honestly, I'm still trying to understand why she went along with whatever Marcus was doing. But there are hundreds of employees at this company who didn't make those choices, who show up every day trusting that their leadership is honest and ethical. They deserve protection. And if I have information that could prevent future harm, then I have a responsibility to share it, regardless of the personal cost. The room was silent for a long moment. Several board members exchanged glances, and I saw a few subtle nods. The chairman had been watching me carefully throughout my answer, his expression unreadable. Now he leaned back in his chair, a slight smile playing at his lips. "Courage runs in your family," he said quietly. "Your mother had it too." The statement landed like a thunderclap. Every board member's attention snapped to the chairman, and I saw genuine surprise on several faces. The woman who'd asked the first question raised her eyebrows, and the skeptical man across from me suddenly looked very interested. "Theodore," the woman said carefully, "what exactly are you referring to?" The chairman folded his hands on the table in front of him. 30 years ago, Emily's mother worked as a junior associate at a firm where I was a senior executive. She witnessed serious misconduct by a senior partner, the father of our current CEO, as it happens. She reported it knowing full well it could destroy her career. It did, temporarily. But her courage eventually led to a full investigation and that man's forced retirement. I've never forgotten the price she paid for doing the right thing. He turned to look at me directly. And I see that same courage sitting here today. Several board members were nodding now, their expressions shifting from skepticism to something closer to respect. The pieces were falling into place for them just as they were for me. This wasn't just about corporate fraud. This was about a pattern spanning decades, about a family vendetta, about the son of a disgraced executive potentially seeking revenge by infiltrating and corrupting the very company his father had been forced to leave. The chairman straightened in his chair, his voice taking on the formal authority of his position. I want to thank Ms. Carter for her testimony and her courage in coming forward. The board will now deliberate on our next steps." He paused, and when he spoke again, his words carried the weight of irreversible decision. "But I can tell you now what one of those steps will be. Effective immediately, Marcus Whitfield is suspended without pay pending the results of the forensic investigation." The suspension announcement hit Henderson and Associates like an earthquake. By Monday afternoon, every employee knew that Marcus Whitfield, the CEO who'd seemed untouchable just a week ago, had been removed from his position pending investigation. The company-wide email from the board was deliberately vague about the reasons, citing only serious allegations requiring immediate attention. But rumors filled the vacuum with remarkable speed. My phone started buzzing with messages almost immediately. Most were from coworkers I barely knew, people who'd been distant acquaintances at best. The first came from a woman named Sarah in the marketing department. "Emily, I just heard what you did. Thank you. Marcus made my life hell for 6 months because I questioned one of his budget decisions. I was too afraid to report it. You're braver than I was." Then another from Tom in IT. "Not sure if you remember me, but I worked on Project X. I saw things that didn't add up and got shut down when I asked questions. Thank you for not staying silent." More messages followed throughout the day. A junior analyst who said Marcus had screamed at her in a meeting until she cried. An account manager who'd been passed over for promotion after refusing to approve a questionable contract. A facilities coordinator who'd been pressured to falsify vendor invoices and had quit rather than comply. One after another, stories poured in from people who'd been hurt, intimidated, or silenced, all of them variations on the same theme: Marcus Whitfield had created a culture of fear, and no one had felt safe enough to challenge him until now. By the time I got home that evening, I had 47 messages. Reading them left me emotionally drained, but also strangely validated. This wasn't just about me or Rachel or my wounded pride. This was about a pattern of abuse that had touched dozens of lives, and I'd somehow become the catalyst for exposing it. The knock on my apartment door came at 8 o'clock. I wasn't expecting visitors, and when I looked through the peephole, my stomach dropped. My parents stood in the hallway. My father's face already red with anger, my mother clutching her purse like a lifeline. I opened the door because I was raised to open the door when my parents knocked. Some habits are too deeply ingrained to break, even when you know what's coming won't be pleasant. "We need to talk." My father pushed past me into the apartment without waiting for an invitation. My mother followed, her eyes already rimmed with red, her hands shaking slightly. "Dad, Mom, Don't." My father's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Don't you dare say a word until I'm finished. Do you know what you've done? Do you have any idea of the damage you've caused?" I closed the door slowly, bracing myself. "I reported fraud. I told the truth about what I found. You destroyed your sister's marriage." My mother's voice cracked, tears streaming down her face. "Rachel called me this morning. Marcus has moved out. He's hired a divorce attorney. She's 3 months pregnant, Emily. 3 months, and you've ruined everything for her." The news of Rachel's pregnancy hit me harder than I expected, but I forced myself to stay focused. "I didn't ruin anything. Marcus did that himself when he committed fraud. Rachel did that when she approved payments she knew were questionable." My father took a step toward me, his face purple now, a vein throbbing in his temple. "Your sister made a mistake. She trusted her husband. She signed papers he put in front of her. That doesn't make her a criminal, but you've taken this vendetta so far that you've destroyed her reputation, her marriage, everything we worked so hard to build. This isn't a vendetta. There are employees who—" "I don't give a damn about other employees," he was shouting now, his voice echoing off my apartment walls. "I care about my family. I care about the fact that my daughter's name is being dragged through the mud because her own sister is too spiteful to let go of a grudge. You were embarrassed at a wedding. Boo-hoo. Get over it. People have dealt with worse." "Richard." My mother put a hand on his arm, but he shook her off. "No, Linda. She needs to hear this. Emily, I'm going to tell you exactly what's going to happen. You're going to withdraw your complaint. You're going to go to the board, and tell them you made mistakes, that you misunderstood what you saw, that you were emotional and not thinking clearly. And then you're going to support your sister publicly. You're going to help us repair the damage you've caused. I felt something shift inside me, a final thread of obligation snapping. No. What did you say? I said no. I won't lie. I won't pretend I didn't see fraud. I won't help cover up something that could hurt innocent people just to protect Rachel's reputation or yours. My father's face went from red to an alarming shade of purple. Then you're not my daughter anymore. Get out. Leave your key on the counter and don't come back. You're dead to this family. Do you understand me, dead? The words should have devastated me, but instead I felt strangely calm. I walked to my kitchen counter, removed the key to my parents' house from my keyring, and set it down gently. My hand didn't shake. My voice didn't break. If standing up for what's right means losing my family, then I guess that's the choice you're forcing me to make. My mother sobbed, covering her face with her hands. For a moment I thought she might say something, might object to my father's ultimatum. Her voice came out muffled and broken. We only wanted the best for you girls. But she didn't stop him. She didn't tell him he was wrong. She just stood there crying while my father grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the door. As I watched them leave, my mother's sobs echoing in the hallway, I realized that sometimes the people who claim to want the best for you are really just protecting their own vision of what your life should look like. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to live in that vision anymore. I stood in my apartment after they left, listening to the silence settle around me like dust. The key to my childhood home sat on the counter where I'd placed it, a small piece of metal that somehow represented 28 years of family dinners and holiday mornings, and the assumption that blood meant unconditional acceptance. I'd just learned that assumption was wrong. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying my father's words, the venom in his voice, the way my mother had cried but hadn't defended me. Part of me wanted to call them, to apologize, to take back everything I'd said and done, just to make the pain stop. But a stronger part, a part that felt newer and more solid, knew that going back would mean betraying not just the employees who'd thanked me for speaking up, but myself. In the morning, I did something I'd never done before. I sat down at my laptop and wrote my parents an email. Not in anger, not seeking reconciliation, but simply to draw a line in the clearest terms I could manage. Mom and Dad, I began, and then deleted it. Too familiar for what this needed to be. I started again. To my parents, I know you're angry with me. I know you believe I've destroyed our family by coming forward with what I found at Henderson and Associates. But I need you to understand something, that I'm only now beginning to understand. My self-respect doesn't mean silence. Love doesn't mean enabling harm. For years I stayed quiet when things bothered me because I thought that's what family loyalty meant. I watched Rachel get preferential treatment and told myself it didn't matter. I accepted being pushed to the background at family gatherings because keeping the peace seemed more important than expressing my feelings. I made myself smaller so everyone else could feel bigger. I paused, reading what I'd written, feeling the truth of it settle into my bones. This wasn't just about the investigation or the wedding. This was about patterns that had been building for decades. What happened at Rachel's wedding, and what I discovered afterward, forced me to make a choice. I could continue staying small and silent, or I could stand up for what I knew was right, even if it meant losing your approval. I chose truth over comfort. I chose integrity over image. And I'm not sorry for that, even though it's cost me more than I ever imagined it would. My fingers hesitated over the keyboard, and then I continued. I'm drawing a line not to hurt you, but to protect myself and others. Family bonds can't be built on fear and pretense. They can't survive if speaking the truth means being disowned. I love you both. I always will. But I can't be part of a family dynamic where love is conditional on my willingness to look the other way when people I care about do harmful things. I can't pretend everything is fine when it isn't. I can't sacrifice my values to preserve an image of perfection that was never real to begin with. I took a breath, feeling tears prick my eyes but refusing to let them fall. When you're ready to have a relationship based on honesty instead of appearances, I'll be here. Until then, I need space to heal and to build a life that feels authentic to who I am, not who you wanted me to be. I hope someday you'll understand. Love, Emily. I read it through 3 times before sending it, making sure every word reflected what I actually felt, rather than what I thought they wanted to hear. Then I hit send before I could second-guess myself. They didn't respond. Not that day or the next or the one after that. The silence from my parents was absolute, a wall that felt more solid than any words could have been. On Helen's advice, I took concrete steps to establish the boundaries I'd written about. I removed myself from the family group chat, muting notifications first, and then finally leaving it entirely when the messages continued to pile up, most of them from aunts and cousins, demanding to know what I thought I was doing. I blocked my father's number after he left 3 voicemails that grew progressively more hostile. I kept my mother's number unblocked, hoping irrationally that she might reach out, might somehow be the bridge that could eventually lead to healing. Helen also suggested I find a therapist, and for the first time in my life, I made an appointment without feeling ashamed about needing help. Dr. Sarah Chen was in her 50s with kind eyes and an office full of plants that somehow made difficult conversations feel less overwhelming. In our first session, I cried for 40 minutes straight, all the grief I'd been holding back finally breaking through. "You're mourning," Dr. Chen said gently. "Not just the loss of your family relationships as they were, but the loss of the family you wished you had. That's real grief, Emily. Let yourself feel it." She also recommended I look into support groups for adults dealing with family estrangement. I found one that met weekly at a community center, a circle of people ranging from their 20s to their 60s, who'd all made the difficult choice to distance themselves from toxic family dynamics. Listening to their stories helped me feel less alone, less like some kind of monster for choosing my well-being over my family's comfort. 3 days after I'd sent the email, my phone buzzed with a text from my mother. My heart leaped, hoping irrationally that it might be an olive branch, some sign that she understood what I'd been trying to say. "We cleared out your room. Your childhood things are in the garage. Come get them when we're not home." I read the message 5 times each reading, making my chest feel tighter. Not "we miss you," not "can we talk," just a cold, practical instruction to retrieve my belongings as if I were a stranger picking up abandoned property. The finality of it hit me like a physical blow. They weren't just angry. They were erasing me, boxing up my existence, and putting it in the garage like unwanted furniture. I waited until Thursday afternoon, a time I knew my father would be at his weekly golf game and my mother at her book club. The thought of facing them, of enduring more accusations or cold silence, felt unbearable. So I drove to the house where I'd grown up, parking in the driveway of what now felt like a stranger's home. The garage code still worked, at least. That small mercy felt almost cruel, a reminder that while I'd been officially cast out, the mechanisms of my former life hadn't quite caught up yet. The garage door rolled up with its familiar grinding sound, revealing my mother's sedan, and in the corner near the workbench, 3 cardboard boxes stacked haphazardly with my name written across them in black marker. I carried the boxes to my car one by one, not bothering to look inside them yet. When I finished, something drew me to try the door leading from the garage into the house. It was unlocked. I knew I shouldn't go in, that I was technically no longer welcome, but I needed to see my room one last time. I needed to understand exactly what they'd done. The house was silent, unchanged in all the ways that mattered. Family photos still lined the hallway, but I noticed with a sick feeling that several frames that used to hold pictures of me had been turned face down. I climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood, and pushed open the door to what had been my bedroom for 18 years. It was completely empty. Not just cleaned out, but erased. The walls that had once been painted a soft lavender were now a sterile white. The closet stood open and bare, no trace of the clothes and books and memories I'd left behind when I'd moved out for college a decade ago. The desk where I'd done homework, the bookshelf that had held my collection of novels, the bulletin board covered with photos of friends, all gone. Even the curtains had been replaced with plain white blinds. It looked like a room waiting for a new occupant, a blank slate with no evidence that I'd ever existed here. I stood in the doorway, feeling tears stream down my face. This wasn't just about removing my belongings. This was about eliminating every trace of me rewriting family history to exclude the daughter who'd dared to step out of line. The only thing that remained was a small cardboard box sitting in the center of the empty floor, as if someone had forgotten it in their hurry to complete the erasure. I knelt and opened it, finding it filled with old photographs. My mother's handwriting on the outside of the box read, "Sarah's Photos 1990s." These weren't pictures of me at all. These were my mother's things from before Rachel and I were born. Photos I'd never seen before. Had she meant to throw this box away, or had she left it here by accident, a piece of her own past mixed up with mine? I was sitting on the floor surrounded by these forgotten photographs when I heard a gentle knock on the doorframe. Mrs. Chen, our neighbor for the past 30 years, stood there with a concerned expression holding 2 paper cups of tea. "Emily, dear, I saw your car in the driveway." She was in her 80s now, her hair completely white, but her eyes still held the same warmth I remembered from childhood. "I thought you might need some company." I wiped my face, hastily embarrassed to be caught crying. "I'm just picking up my things. I'll be gone soon." "May I?" She gestured to the floor beside me, and when I nodded, she settled down with surprising grace for her age, handing me one of the cups. The tea was jasmine sweet and comforting. We sat in silence for a moment, the empty room somehow less oppressive with her presence. "I watched you grow up in this house," she said finally. "Watched you ride your bike in the driveway, saw you leave for prom, waved to you when you came home from college. And I've watched your parents these past 2 weeks, seen how they've hardened themselves against you." She took a sip of her tea, choosing her words carefully. "My own daughter stopped speaking to me for 5 years once. Different reasons, but the same pain. I know what it's like to feel like you've lost your family." "What did you do?" My voice came out rough with tears. "I learned to keep my grace, but not my guilt. I learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is maintain your boundaries even when others punish you for having them." She patted my hand gently. "You did the right thing, Emily. The hard thing and the right thing are often the same thing. Don't let their anger make you doubt that." Her words settled into the hollow space inside me, not filling it, but making it somehow more bearable. We finished our tea sitting on the floor of my empty childhood bedroom, and when we finally stood to leave, I felt steadier than I had in days. I loaded the forgotten box of my mother's photographs into my car, along with my own belongings, uncertain why I was taking them, but unable to leave them behind in that emptied room. Mrs. Chen hugged me in the driveway, whispering, "You're stronger than you know. Don't forget that." The women's support group Dr. Chen had recommended met that evening in a church basement across town. There were 8 of us, ranging from a woman in her early 20s to a grandmother in her 60s. We sat in a circle of folding chairs, and as each person shared their story of family estrangement, I felt the isolation that had been crushing me begin to lift. The reasons varied: addiction, abuse, toxic behavior, irreconcilable values. But the core experience was the same. We'd all chosen our well-being over our family's comfort, and we were all learning to live with the grief and guilt and unexpected freedom that choice had brought. When it was my turn to speak, I told them about the wedding, the investigation, the empty bedroom. A woman named Jennifer, who'd been estranged from her parents for 3 years, nodded with recognition. "It gets easier," she said. "Not simple, but easier. You learn that you can build a new family from people who choose to love you as you are, not as they wish you would be." I drove home that night feeling less alone than I had since the night of Rachel's wedding. My phone was on the passenger seat, and when it rang, Helen's name appeared on the screen. I pulled over to answer. "Emily." Her voice carried an urgency I'd rarely heard from her. "The forensic audit team found something big. You need to come to my office tomorrow. First thing. This changes everything." I arrived at Helen's office at 8 the next morning. my mind still turning over what she'd said on the phone. Something big, something that changed everything. But when I walked into her conference room, what she showed me first wasn't new evidence from the audit. It was a pattern I hadn't fully recognized until she laid it out in front of me. Before we get to what the auditors found, I need you to see something else. Helen had her laptop open a folder displayed on the screen containing a series of emails. You've been receiving anonymous tips for 2 weeks now. I want to talk about them. I'd almost forgotten about those emails in the chaos of everything else. The first had arrived 3 days after the wedding, sent from an address that was just a string of random numbers and letters at an encrypted email service. The subject line had read simply, "You're not alone," and the message contained a single cryptic instruction: check the server logs from 2 a.m. November 12th. I'd thought it was spam at first, nearly deleted it. But something made me follow the instruction, logging into the company's document management system and pulling up the server activity logs for that date. What I found was a record of someone accessing the vendor payment database at 2:17 in the morning, downloading files and then deleting the access record. The user ID belonged to Rachel, but the IP address traced to Marcus's home office. The second email had come 4 days later. Look at vendor contracts filed under miscellaneous subfolder archive 2019. I'd found it buried deep in the company's digital filing system, a folder that should have contained old inactive contracts, but instead held active agreements with the same phantom vendors the auditors were now investigating. Someone had hidden them where they thought no one would look. More emails had followed each one, pointing me toward a specific piece of evidence. Invoice 22847 payment date doesn't match approval date. Check CEO's expense reports for Monaco trip, compare to company calendar. Review board meeting minutes from June 2023. Note who objected to hiring external auditors. Each tip had been precise, specific, and accurate. Whoever was sending them had intimate knowledge of Henderson and Associates' systems and access to information that should have been restricted to senior management. Helen had printed out all the anonymous emails and spread them across her conference table in chronological order. Look at the pattern. Each email came exactly when you needed it most. When the investigation was stalling, you got a tip that pushed it forward. When the auditors hit a dead end, you received information that opened a new avenue. This isn't random. Someone is orchestrating this, feeding you exactly what you need when you need it. I studied the timeline she'd created, seeing what she meant. The emails were strategic, timed to maximum effect. Do we know who's sending them? I had a cybersecurity expert analyze the source. The emails are routed through multiple encrypted servers in different countries. Professionally done, untraceable, without resources we don't have. But here's what we do know. She pulled up a technical document I couldn't begin to understand. The information in these emails requires access to systems that only about a dozen people in the company can reach. Senior executives, IT administrators, maybe a few people in finance with elevated privileges. Whoever this is, they're not some low-level employee. They have serious access, and they've been watching Marcus for a long time. Why not just come forward themselves? Why hide behind encrypted emails? Helen leaned back in her chair, considering. Maybe they're afraid of retaliation. Maybe they have something to lose that you don't. Or maybe... She paused, choosing her words carefully. Maybe they've been waiting for someone brave enough to be the public face of this fight. They're feeding you the ammunition, but you're the one pulling the trigger. The thought sent a chill through me. I wasn't fighting alone, but I was also being used, carefully guided by someone with their own agenda. Should that make me nervous? Normally, yes, but so far, everything they've given you has been legitimate evidence of real wrongdoing. They're not trying to frame anyone or manufacture false charges. They want Marcus to fall, and they're giving you the tools to make that happen. Helen gathered the printed emails into a neat stack. The question is why? Why does this person want him destroyed so badly that they're willing to take these risks? Before I could respond, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, then looked up at me with an expression I couldn't read. Another email just came in, same encrypted address. She turned her laptop toward me. The email had arrived 30 seconds ago. Subject line blank message containing just 5 words in plain text. Check his father's old scandal. I stared at the screen, my mind immediately jumping to the photograph the chairman had shown me. Marcus's father standing with executives from 30 years ago. My mother visible in the corner of the frame. The chairman's cryptic comment about my mother having courage about witnessing misconduct. "What scandal?" I asked, though I was already beginning to piece together the answer. Helen was already typing, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "Give me a minute. If there was a corporate scandal significant enough to be called the old scandal, there should be records, news articles, legal filings, something." She pulled up a database of business news archives, entering search terms I couldn't see from my angle. Her screen filled with results, and I watched her face change as she read, her expression shifting from curiosity to shock. "Oh my God." What did you find?" She turned the laptop toward me again, this time displaying a scanned newspaper article from 1994. The headline read, "Henderson and Associates executive forced to resign amid sexual harassment investigation." Below it was a photograph of a man I recognized from the picture the chairman had shown me, Marcus's father looking defiant as he left the company's headquarters, surrounded by reporters. I scanned the article quickly, my heart pounding. The details were sparse, limited by the reporting standards of the era, and probably by legal settlements. But the basic story was clear. Multiple women had accused Gerald Whitfield, then a senior vice president at Henderson and Associates, of sexual harassment spanning several years. An internal investigation had been launched after a formal complaint was filed. Whitfield had resigned before the investigation concluded, accepting what the article called a separation agreement that likely involved significant money in exchange for his silence. The article mentioned that one of the women who'd filed complaints had been a junior associate named Sarah Chen. My mother's maiden name. My mother had been one of the women who'd stood up to Gerald Whitfield 30 years ago. She'd filed a formal complaint that had contributed to his forced resignation, and now his son had married into our family, positioned himself at the top of the same company, and was perpetrating the same kind of corrupt behavior that had destroyed his father's career. The symmetry was too perfect to be coincidental. Helen and I spent the next hour researching every detail we could find about the 1994 scandal. The coverage was limited by the standards of that era, but we pieced together enough to understand that my mother's courage had cost her dearly. She'd left Henderson and Associates shortly after Whitfield's resignation, her promising career derailed by the stigma that still attached to women who reported harassment in those days. The chairman had been a junior executive, then a witness to her courage, and apparently he'd never forgotten. 2 days later, I received a call from Margaret Harrison requesting my presence at corporate headquarters. The IT forensics team had completed their analysis of the company's server data, and the chairman wanted me to hear their findings directly. The presentation took place in the same boardroom where I'd testified before the full board. This time, only Chairman Mitchell, 2 board members, Helen, and the lead IT forensics specialist were present. The specialist, a serious young woman named Denise Park, had her laptop connected to the room's large display screen. "Ms. Carter, thank you for coming." Chairman Mitchell gestured to a seat. "Denise has recovered some very significant data from our backup systems. I think you'll want to see this." Denise pulled up a series of screen captures showing server activity logs. When files are deleted from our system, they're not immediately erased. They're moved to a backup server where they remain for 90 days before permanent deletion. We've been able to recover deleted emails, modified records, and access logs that someone tried to hide. She clicked through to a detailed timeline. On November 12th, at 2:17 a.m., someone logged into the system using CEO Marcus Whitfield's credentials from his home IP address. That person accessed confidential employee files, including performance reviews and HR complaints. They downloaded copies of several documents, then deleted the access logs to hide their activity. "But you recovered the logs," I said. "We did, and there's more." Another click brought up a list of deleted emails. Between September and November of this year, approximately 47 emails were permanently deleted from the company's servers. These weren't just moved to trash folders, they were purged using administrative tools that require executive-level access. The emails all related to Project X vendor payments, budget questions, and communications between employees raising concerns about financial irregularities. Helen leaned forward. "Can you prove who deleted them?" The deletion commands were executed using Mr. Whitfield's login credentials. However, some of the individual emails were first accessed using Ms. Rachel Whitfield's credentials before being deleted from Mr. Whitfield's account. It appears they were working together to systematically remove evidence of employee concerns about the fraudulent payments. The board member to the chairman's left, a distinguished woman named Patricia Oakes, spoke up. "This demonstrates clear obstruction of justice. They weren't just committing fraud, they were actively covering their tracks and eliminating evidence." Chairman Mitchell nodded gravely, then turned to another folder on the table. "Patricia Chen from the audit team has completed her preliminary findings. Patricia." The forensic auditor I'd met weeks ago entered the room carrying a thick binder. She took a seat and opened it with practiced efficiency. "Our audit has identified $2.3 million in questionable payments over a 3-year period. These payments were made to 7 different consulting firms, all of which appear to be shell companies with no legitimate business operations. The payments were approved by Ms. Rachel Whitfield. But our analysis shows they were always processed within 24 hours of meetings between Ms. Whitfield and Mr. Whitfield." She slid several documents across the table. "We've traced the payments to a series of bank accounts in Delaware and Nevada. The accounts are registered to limited liability companies, but when we investigated the ownership structure, they all ultimately connect to a trust controlled by Mr. Whitfield's family. The money went out as vendor payments and essentially came back to him through a complicated web of corporate entities." "Money laundering," Helen said quietly. "That's exactly what it is," Patricia confirmed. "And the paper trail is clear. Ms. Whitfield may have signed the approvals, but Mr. Whitfield designed the scheme and benefited from it financially." Chairman Mitchell closed the folder and looked directly at me. "Emily, we've reached a point where this investigation needs someone who understands both the technical details and the human element of what happened. Someone the employees trust who has proven integrity and who can help us ensure we've uncovered the full scope of this fraud." He paused, his expression serious. "I'd like to offer you a position as special advisor to this investigation for the next 30 days. It would be a paid role reporting directly to the board. Your job would be to work with the forensic team, interview employees who may have information, and help us understand exactly how deep this corruption goes." The offer caught me completely off guard. "You want me to officially work on the investigation against my own sister and brother-in-law? I want you to help us protect this company and its employees from people who abused their positions of trust. Your sister and Marcus made their choices. Now we need to make ours." He leaned back in his chair. "I won't pretend this won't be difficult, but you're the right person for this role, and I believe you know that." Helen touched my arm gently, a silent reminder that I didn't have to answer immediately. But I already knew what my response would be. This was my chance to see this through properly, to ensure that the investigation was thorough, and that the employees who'd trusted me with their stories weren't let down. "I'll do it," I said, "but I have one condition." The chairman raised an eyebrow. "Go on." "We protect the whistleblowers. Anyone who comes forward with information gets immunity and protection from retaliation. And when this is over, everything we find becomes public. Full transparency. No quiet settlements that let Marcus walk away with his reputation intact. If we're going to do this, we do it right." Chairman Mitchell smiled, and for the first time since I'd met him, I saw genuine warmth in his expression. "Those aren't just acceptable conditions, Ms. Carter. They're exactly the standards we should be holding ourselves to." He extended his hand across the table. "Welcome to the investigation team." The board convened an emergency session that same afternoon to formalize my appointment. I sat in the same boardroom where I'd testified weeks earlier, but this time I wasn't a witness under scrutiny. I was about to become part of the investigation itself, with real authority to shape how it proceeded. Patricia Oakes read aloud the motion for the record. The Board of Directors hereby appoints Emily Carter as Special Advisor to the fraud investigation for a period of 30 days, with the authority to interview employees, review financial records, and make recommendations to the Board regarding investigative priorities. Furthermore, the Board commits to full transparency regarding investigation findings, including public disclosure of all substantiated fraud, and establishes comprehensive whistleblower protections for any employee who provides information related to this matter. The vote was unanimous. 12 hands raised in support, 12 voices saying "Aye" in succession. Chairman Mitchell signed the official document in front of everyone, his signature bold and decisive across the bottom of the page. He slid the paper across the table to me, along with a pen. "Your signature makes it official," he said, "and it means you're committing to see this through no matter where it leads." I signed without hesitation. My handwriting looked small next to the chairman's, but it was steady. No trembling, no second thoughts. Whatever came next, I was ready for it. Margaret Harrison handed me a folder containing my official credentials, building access authorization, and contact information for the full investigation team. I was no longer on administrative leave. I was employed again, but in a role I never could have imagined a month ago. "Your first task," Chairman Mitchell said, "is to make recommendations for how we ensure employees feel safe coming forward. We know there are likely others who witnessed problems but were afraid to report them. How do we change that?" I'd been thinking about this question since he'd first offered me the position. We need an anonymous reporting hotline separate from our regular HR channels. It should be managed by an outside firm with no connection to company leadership. Employees need to know their information won't be traced back to them unless they choose to identify themselves. One of the board members, a man named Robert Chen, who'd been quiet during most of our previous meeting, nodded approvingly. "That's standard practice for companies dealing with major internal investigations. I can recommend several firms that specialize in this. And we need to make a public commitment." I continued, feeling more confident as I spoke. "Not just internal memos, but a statement that goes to all employees and gets posted on our website. Make it clear that retaliation against whistleblowers will result in immediate termination, regardless of position or tenure. People need to see that we're serious about protecting them." Patricia Oakes was already typing notes on her laptop. "I'll draft language for board approval. We can have the hotline operational within 48 hours and the public statement released simultaneously." The board discussed implementation details for another 20 minutes, but the fundamental decisions were already made. My conditions weren't just being accepted, they were being embraced as the right way forward. For the first time since Rachel had fired me at her wedding, I felt like I had some measure of control over what was happening. After the meeting adjourned, Chairman Mitchell asked me to stay behind. The other board members filed out, leaving just the two of us in the large room. He walked to the windows overlooking the city, his hands clasped behind his back, and stood there for a long moment before speaking. "You remind me of your mother," he said finally, his voice carrying a weight of old memories. "Not just physically, though the resemblance is remarkable. It's the way you approach difficult situations. The same unwillingness to compromise on principles, even when it costs you." I joined him at the window, unsure what to say. "I found the article about the 1994 scandal, about what happened to her." "Then you know she paid a high price for doing the right thing. Gerald Whitfield was forced out, but your mother's career suffered too. That's how it worked back then. The women who reported harassment were often punished alongside the men who'd harassed them. Different era, different standards, but the same basic injustice." He turned to face me, and I saw something in his eyes I hadn't noticed before. A deep sadness mixed with what might have been regret. "I was there when she filed her complaint. I was young, ambitious, too, worried about my own career to stand up for her publicly. I've always regretted that silence. Is that why you're helping me now? Partly. But mostly I'm helping you because what you're doing is right, and because this company needs people like you, people who won't look the other way when powerful people abuse their positions. He placed a hand on my shoulder briefly, a gesture that felt almost paternal. You're principled, Emily. That's a rare quality, especially when maintaining those principles means losing your family. Your mother understood that cost. I think she'd be proud of what you're doing. The emotion in his voice suggested there was much more to his relationship with my mother than he was saying layers of history I might never fully understand. But before I could ask any follow-up questions, his phone buzzed with an urgent message. He glanced at the screen and his expression darkened. You need to see this. He pulled up a website on his phone and handed it to me. It was a video sharing platform, and the top trending video in the local section had a thumbnail I recognized immediately: Rachel in her wedding dress kneeling on the ballroom floor, phone pressed to her ear. The title read, CEO's wife fires sister at wedding reception, then gets destroyed by boss. The view counter showed 10:247 and was climbing rapidly as I watched. Someone had posted the full wedding video online, complete with audio of the chairman's voice coming through the phone speaker. The comments section was already filling with reactions, thousands of strangers weighing in on the most painful moment of my life. The video had been posted by someone named Jennifer K., according to the account information. I vaguely remembered a Jennifer sitting at one of the tables near where Rachel had knelt a friend of Marcus's from his previous company. She'd apparently thought the moment was too dramatic not to share captioning it with laughing emojis and the hashtag wedding drama. What she probably expected to be a funny story for her few hundred followers had instead caught fire. By the next morning, the view count had hit 500,000. By evening, it crossed 2 million. The algorithm had picked it up, pushing it to wider and wider audiences, and what had been a private family catastrophe was now public entertainment for millions of strangers. I watched it spread with a sick feeling in my stomach. My phone buzzed constantly with notifications, people I hadn't spoken to in years, reaching out, some offering support, others asking for the real story. Helen called 3 times before I finally answered. Every major news outlet is requesting interviews, she said without preamble. Local channels, national morning shows, even some international media. This is bigger than a corporate fraud case now. This is a human interest story, and you're at the center of it. I declined all interview requests following Helen's advice to stay silent while the investigation was ongoing. But my silence didn't stop the story from growing. By day 3, the video had 5 million views and had been picked up by local television news. A reporter stood outside Henderson & Associates headquarters, doing a segment about corporate culture and family dynamics in the modern workplace. Another station interviewed employment law experts about whether Rachel's public termination constituted wrongful dismissal. The national media followed quickly. Morning talk shows discussed the incident during their trending topics segments. A cable news channel ran a piece titled, When Family Business Gets Personal, the Wedding Firing That Shocked America. The comment sections beneath every article, every social media post, every news segment became battlegrounds where strangers argued about who was right and who was wrong. Many people supported me. They called Rachel's actions cruel and unprofessional, praised the chairman for intervening, and expressed outrage at my parents' complicity. But others saw it differently. They accused me of being vindictive, of using the investigation to get revenge for a family dispute, of destroying my sister's life over a moment of poor judgment. Some comments were vicious, attacking my appearance, my career, my character in ways that made me feel exposed and vulnerable. The public exposure hit my parents hardest. My father's business operated on reputation and relationships, and suddenly everyone in his social circle had seen the video. His golf buddies had questions. His country club friends wanted to know what was really going on. The charitable organizations where he served on boards were asking uncomfortable questions about his judgment and his family's stability. My mother faced even worse scrutiny. She couldn't go to the grocery store without being recognized. At church the following Sunday, according to a text from Aunt Patricia that somehow reached me through a forwarded chain, several parishioners had approached her asking about that terrible wedding incident. She'd left in tears before the service ended. Mrs. Chen, my elderly neighbor from my parents' street, sent me a kind email describing what she was witnessing. Your mother hasn't left the house in 3 days except to get the mail. Your father comes and goes for work, but he looks 10 years older. I know you're estranged, but I thought you should know they're suffering. The guilt was crushing, even though I knew logically that I hadn't posted the video, hadn't made it go viral, hadn't asked for any of this public attention. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally were two different things. On the 4th day after the video went viral, my phone rang with a number I recognized Rachel's cell phone. I stared at it for 3 rings before answering, my hand shaking. Hello. Are you happy now? Rachel's voice was raw, shaking with emotion. The whole country is laughing at us. I can't go outside without people recognizing me from that video. Marcus's lawyers are saying it's damaged his reputation so badly it's affecting his defense. Mom is being harassed at church. Dad's business partners are distancing themselves from him. We're a national joke, Emily. Is this what you wanted? I didn't post that video, Rachel. I never wanted any of this to be public. But you set it all in motion. She was crying now, her words coming out in jagged bursts. You could have just let it go. You could have accepted the firing quietly and moved on. But you had to push, had to investigate, had to turn this into some kind of crusade. And now look what's happened. Everything we built, everything our family worked for, it's all destroyed. I wanted to argue, to defend myself, to point out that she was the one who'd fired me publicly, that Marcus was the one who'd committed fraud, that I was just trying to do the right thing. But something in her voice stopped me. Beneath the anger, I heard desperation and fear. Rachel, I'm pregnant. The words came out in a whisper, cutting through everything else. 3 months. And I'm going through this alone because my husband is suspended and facing criminal charges. My parents won't speak to my sister, and everyone I know has seen me at the worst moment of my life. I'm about to be a single mother, Emily, and I don't know how I'm going to survive this. The line went quiet except for her crying. I sat down heavily on my couch, the weight of her words settling over me like lead. The silence stretched between us, heavy with everything unsaid. I could hear Rachel's ragged breathing on the other end of the line, could picture her sitting somewhere alone, scared, facing a future that looked nothing like what she'd imagined on her wedding day. Rachel, I'm so sorry. I didn't know about the baby. How could you? We weren't speaking. Her voice had lost its anger, replaced by a hollow exhaustion. I found out 2 weeks before the wedding. Marcus was thrilled. He wanted to announce it at the reception, make it this big celebration. I talked him out of it, said I wanted to wait until the 2nd trimester to be safe, but really I just wanted one day that felt normal before everything got complicated. You can't go through this alone. There has to be support, available resources. You don't understand. She cut me off, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Marcus has been calling me every day since the suspension. His lawyers are drawing up custody papers. He's threatened that if I cooperate with the investigation in any way, if I testify against him or provide any information that hurts his defense, he'll fight for full custody. He says with his lawyers and his money, and my role in approving those payments, he'll prove I'm an unfit mother. He says I'll lose our child. The cruelty of it took my breath away. He can't do that. No judge would. He can try. And the trying alone will destroy me. Do you know what custody battles cost emotionally, financially? I don't have his resources. I signed a prenup that leaves me with almost nothing if we divorce within 5 years. Everything goes to him except a small settlement. I can't afford the kind of lawyers he can hire. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice broke. Emily, I know what he did was wrong. I'm not defending the fraud or the payments or any of it. But this baby is innocent. This is my child, and if you destroy Marcus completely, if he goes to prison and loses everything, what happens to us? What kind of life can I give this baby with no money, no support, and a father in federal prison? I heard a rustling sound, and then my phone buzzed with an incoming image. Rachel had sent me a photo, a grainy black and white ultrasound showing a tiny figure measurements and medical notations printed along the edges. My niece or nephew, barely formed but undeniably real. "Mom and Dad knew," Rachel continued. "I told them right after I found out. That's why they've been so desperate to make this all go away. They're not just protecting me or Marcus, they're trying to protect their grandchild." Suddenly, my parents' frantic defense made a terrible kind of sense. Their demands that I apologize and drop the investigation weren't just about pride or reputation. They were trying to preserve whatever stability they could for a grandchild who was about to be born into chaos. It didn't excuse their behavior, but it explained it. "What do you want me to do?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "I don't know. I honestly don't know." Rachel's voice was thick with tears. "I hate that I'm asking you to choose between justice and your family. But that's where we are, isn't it? If you keep pushing this investigation, if Marcus ends up in prison, my baby loses a father, and I lose any chance at a stable life. But if you stop, then he gets away with what he did, and all those people he hurt don't get justice." After we hung up, I sat in my dark apartment for hours, turning the impossible choice over in my mind. The ultrasound photo remained on my phone screen, that tiny figure representing a life that hadn't asked to be born into this mess. My niece or nephew would carry the weight of whatever decisions were made, now would grow up shaped by consequences of actions they had no part in choosing. I called Helen at midnight, knowing she'd still be awake. "I don't know what to do," I told her, my voice raw. "There's a baby involved now, an innocent child who's going to suffer no matter what choice I make." "Emily, you're not responsible for Marcus's choices. You're not responsible for Rachel's situation. You didn't create this mess." "But I'm making it worse. If I back off now, maybe Rachel has a chance. Maybe the baby has a chance at a normal life. And if you back off, Marcus continues to be who he is. He finds another company, another position of power, and he does this again. How many more people get hurt because you chose to protect one child at the expense of future victims?" Helen's voice was gentle but firm. "There are no good options here. But there are options that align with your principles and options that don't." I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that ultrasound image, thought about a child being born into a family torn apart by scandal and legal battles. But I also thought about the employees who'd thanked me for speaking up about Frank risking his job, to send me tips about my mother 30 years ago, making the same impossible choice I was facing now. By morning, I still hadn't found an answer. I was making coffee when my phone rang with an unknown number. A woman's voice, older and uncertain, asked if she was speaking to Emily Carter. "This is she. My name is Martha Reynolds. I was Marcus Whitfield's executive secretary at his previous company before he came to Henderson and Associates. I saw the video and I've been following the investigation in the news. I need to meet with you. It's urgent." "What is this about?" "It's about your sister, and it's about the prenuptial agreement she signed. There are things about that contract you need to know, things that change everything about her situation with Marcus." Martha's voice was tight with suppressed emotion. "Can we meet today, please? What I have to tell you can't wait." We agreed to meet at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town, far from Henderson and Associates, and anywhere we might be recognized. Martha Reynolds arrived precisely on time, a slim woman in her late 50s with steel-gray hair pulled into a neat bun, and eyes that held a weariness I recognized from looking in my own mirror lately. She carried a worn leather briefcase that looked like it had seen decades of use. "Thank you for meeting me," she said as she slid into the booth across from me. "I know this must seem strange, a stranger calling you out of the blue, claiming to have information about your brother-in-law." "At this point, nothing seems strange anymore," I said. "You mentioned you worked for Marcus at his previous company. For 3 years, from 2012 to 2015. I was his executive secretary at Meridian Financial Group before he moved to Henderson and Associates." She opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder, setting it on the table between us. I've been carrying this with me for 10 years, waiting for the right moment to use it. When I saw what was happening with your family, when I realized someone was finally brave enough to stand up to him, I knew that moment had come. She opened the folder to reveal stacks of printed emails, all meticulously organized with dates and subject lines highlighted. Marcus ran the same kickback scheme at Meridian that he's been running at your company. Fake vendors, shell companies, fraudulent invoices. I processed many of these payments myself, not realizing at first what they really were. By the time I understood what was happening, I was complicit. He made sure of that. I scanned the emails she showed me, seeing the same pattern that Patricia Chen's audit had uncovered at Henderson & Associates. Payments to consulting firms that didn't exist, invoices for services never rendered, money flowing out and eventually cycling back through a complex network of corporate entities. Why didn't you report this back then? Martha's expression hardened. I tried. I went to the CFO with my concerns. 2 days later, Marcus called me into his office and made me an offer. He said I could either accept a generous severance package and sign an NDA, or he would make sure I never worked in corporate America again. He had connections power, and he wasn't subtle about threatening to use both. She paused, her hands tightening on the edge of the folder. And when I still hesitated when I said I needed to think about it, he made a different kind of advance. He cornered me after hours, told me there were other ways I could show my loyalty. When I refused him, he became vicious. The pain in her voice was raw even after all these years. I'm so sorry. He destroyed my career anyway. I took the severance and signed the NDA because I had a daughter in college and I couldn't afford to fight him. But I kept copies of everything before I left. I told myself that someday, somehow I'd find a way to make him pay for what he did. She pulled out another document, this one appearing to be a legal contract. When I heard he was getting married, I did some research. I found out about your sister, looked into their relationship, and I managed to get a copy of their prenuptial agreement through a contact who works at Marcus's law firm. She slid the prenup across the table to me. It was over 30 pages long, dense with legal language that would take hours to parse fully. But Martha had highlighted specific sections in yellow. Your sister signed away almost everything in this agreement. If they divorce within 5 years of marriage, she receives a settlement of only $50,000 and no spousal support. All marital assets remain with Marcus. The house, the cars, the bank accounts, everything goes to him. That's unconscionable, I said, scanning the highlighted sections. No lawyer would have advised her to sign this. Look at page 17, section 8, the morality clause. Martha pointed to a paragraph that made my blood run cold as I read it. The clause stated that if Rachel engaged in any behavior that brought public disgrace or reputational harm to Marcus Whitfield, she would forfeit even the minimal settlement specified in the agreement. Furthermore, in the event of divorce, custody of any children would default to Marcus based on a predetermined finding that Rachel's conduct made her an unsuitable primary guardian. This was written before she was even pregnant, I said, horrified. He planned this from the beginning. Marcus always has a plan. He married your sister knowing that if things went wrong, he could walk away with everything, while she'd be left with nothing. And now he's using that contract to keep her silent. She's trapped Emily. She approved those fraudulent payments because he told her to, probably convinced her it was normal business practice. And now she's facing the consequences while he's positioned to abandon her and take their child. I thought about Rachel's desperate phone call, her fear of losing custody, the impossible choice she thought she was forcing me to make. She wasn't just protecting Marcus out of loyalty or love. She was being coerced by a contract she'd signed before she understood what kind of man she was marrying. Your sister is a victim too, Martha continued, her voice softening. She made bad choices, yes. She should have asked more questions, should have refused to approve payments she didn't understand. But Marcus is very good at manipulation. He finds vulnerable people, people who want to please him or who are dazzled by his success, and he uses them. When they're no longer useful, he discards them. I've seen him do it over and over. Why come forward now? The NDA you signed? I'm 58 years old. My daughter graduated college years ago. I have nothing left to lose, and I'm tired of carrying this weight. Martha reached into her briefcase one more time and pulled out a small flash drive, setting it on top of the folder of documents. Everything is on here. Bank records from his time at Meridian showing the same shell company patterns. Email correspondence proving he designed the fraud scheme. Contracts with vendors that never performed any actual work. Text messages where he explicitly instructs people to falsify records. And documentation of 3 other women he harassed or coerced during his time there. Women who signed NDAs like I did, but who've given me permission to share their stories if it means finally stopping him. She slid the flash drive across the table toward me, and the small piece of plastic suddenly felt impossibly heavy with the weight of what it represented. This is enough to bury him for 20 years, Emily. Federal fraud charges, securities violations, potentially even RICO charges if prosecutors want to argue he was running a criminal enterprise. He won't just lose his job, he'll lose his freedom. Martha met my eyes, and I saw a decade of suppressed anger and pain in her expression. Your sister doesn't have to protect him. This prenup won't hold up once his fraud is fully exposed. No judge will enforce a contract designed to coerce silence about criminal activity. But she needs to know that before she makes any more choices out of fear. I left the cafe with Martha's flash drive burning a hole in my pocket and a new understanding of just how calculated Marcus's cruelty had been. But before I could decide what to do with this information, I needed to talk to Rachel, not as adversaries in an investigation, but as sisters who both needed to understand the full truth of what had happened to us. I texted her from the parking lot. Can we meet? Just the 2 of us? No parents, no lawyers, no Marcus. Please. Her response came 3 minutes later. Coffee shop on Maple Street. 1 hour. Come alone. The coffee shop was a small, independent place we'd both loved as teenagers, back when our biggest concerns were college applications and whether we'd make curfew. I arrived first and chose a table in the back corner away from the windows and other customers. Rachel walked in exactly on time wearing oversized sunglasses despite the overcast weather and a baseball cap pulled low over her face. She looked thinner than I remembered her face drawn, and when she took off the sunglasses, I could see dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. We sat in awkward silence for a moment, neither of us sure how to begin a conversation that needed to cover so much ground. Finally, Rachel spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want to fire you at the wedding. I need you to know that. Then why did you do it? Her hands trembled as she wrapped them around her coffee cup. Because 3 days before the wedding, Marcus sat me down and told me I needed to prove my loyalty. He said you'd been asking too many questions about Project X, that you were becoming a liability to the company. He said, if I wanted our marriage to work, if I wanted him to trust me, I needed to show him that I'd put us first. Tears started sliding down her cheeks, and she made no effort to wipe them away. He told me if I didn't handle it his way publicly and decisively, he'd consider it a betrayal. And the prenup I'd signed had language about betrayal, about loyalty, about what would happen if I didn't support him completely. Rachel, that prenup? I know it was insane. I had a lawyer look at it before I signed, and she told me not to do it, said the terms were completely one-sided. But Marcus said it was standard for people at his level, said it protected both of us, said if I trusted him, I'd sign it without making a fuss. She finally wiped at her eyes with a napkin. And I wanted to trust him so badly. Dad was so proud of the match, kept telling everyone how I'd married so well. Mom was already planning grandchildren. I felt like I couldn't back out without disappointing everyone. I thought about our father's pride, about how his identity had become wrapped up in Rachel's successful marriage to a powerful man. How long has Marcus been controlling you like this? It started small, maybe 6 months after we got engaged. He wanted to know where I was going, who I was seeing. He said it was because he cared, because he wanted to be part of my life. Then he started managing my finances. Said it made sense since he was better with money. He had me add him to all my accounts, convinced me to let him handle our investments. Her voice dropped even lower. Then he started monitoring my phone. He installed tracking software, said it was for safety. He'd get angry if I didn't respond to his texts immediately. He isolated me from my friends, always had reasons why we couldn't see them, why they weren't good influences, why our relationship should come first. Listening to her describe the progression, I recognized the classic pattern of psychological abuse. The gradual erosion of autonomy, the increasing control disguised as love and protection, the isolation that left the victim dependent and afraid. When did you realize what was happening? I think I always knew on some level, but I kept telling myself I was overreacting, that this was just what marriage looked like, that I needed to be more accommodating. She met my eyes for the first time since sitting down. The morning of the wedding, I almost called it off. I stood in the bridal suite looking at myself in that dress, and I thought, I don't want this life. But then I thought about the guests already arriving, the money spent, Dad's excitement, the fact that I was 35, and everyone said I was lucky to have found someone, so I went through with it. The anger I'd been carrying toward my sister for weeks began to dissolve, replaced by a terrible recognition. We'd both been victims of Marcus Whitfield's manipulation, just in different ways. He'd used my sister's desire for approval and stability against her, while he'd used my professional dedication and attention to detail to build a paper trail he could later exploit. We were both caught in his web, both suffering because we'd had the misfortune of crossing his path. Rachel, I met with someone today, Marcus's former secretary from his previous job. I pulled out the prenup Martha had given me and slid it across the table. She showed me this. The morality clause, the custody provisions, none of it will hold up once his fraud is fully exposed. You're not trapped. The baby will be protected. But Marcus has to face consequences for what he's done. She stared at the document, tears falling faster now. I want to believe that. But he has so much power, such expensive lawyers. He had power. But between the audit, the evidence I've collected, and what Martha gave me today, he's going to prison. The question is whether you go down with him or whether you cooperate with the investigation and protect yourself and your baby. Rachel was quiet for a long moment, processing what I'd said. When she finally spoke, her voice was steadier than it had been all afternoon. There's something else you need to know. Something about our family that I only recently discovered. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her photos, then turned the screen toward me. Remember that photograph the chairman showed you? His father with Mom and Marcus's father. I found the original in Mom's things when I was helping her clean out the attic last month. The back of the photo has names and a date. I looked at the image on her phone, the same photo I'd seen in the chairman's office, but this version showed the complete picture with handwriting on the back. The names listed included my mother, Sarah Chen, Theodore Mitchell, Gerald Whitfield, and several others I didn't recognize. But it was the date that made my heart stop, June 15, 1994. That's the same month Mom filed her harassment complaint, I said. Look at the full version. Rachel swiped to another photo showing the complete image from the front. In the original, my mother wasn't just standing in the corner. She was positioned between Theodore Mitchell and Gerald Whitfield, and both men had their hands on her shoulders. Her expression wasn't just uncomfortable, it was frightened. Emily, I think the harassment Mom reported wasn't just from Gerald Whitfield. I think there's a bigger story here, one that involves the chairman too. And I think Marcus knew about it when he targeted our family. Rachel's revelation about the photograph hung in the air between us, adding another layer of complexity to an already tangled story. But before I could process the implications about the chairman and my mother, I needed to understand what Martha had given me. I needed to see exactly what evidence was on that flash drive. That evening, I met with Helen and Chairman Mitchell in a secure conference room at Henderson & Associates. The building was nearly empty at 7 p.m., just security guards and a few dedicated employees working late. I'd brought both the physical documents Martha had provided and the flash drive, and Helen had her laptop ready to examine the digital files. Before we look at this, I said to the chairman, I need to ask you something. The photograph from 1994, the one with my mother and Gerald Whitfield. Rachel found the original, and there's something about it that doesn't add up. Your hands were on my mother's shoulders too. What exactly happened that day? The chairman's expression grew grave. That's a conversation we need to have. Emily and I promise you we will. But right now, let's focus on what you have here. We can untangle the past after we deal with the present. Helen inserted the flash drive, and we spent the next 2 hours going through its contents in methodical detail. What Martha had preserved was nothing short of a complete blueprint of Marcus Whitfield's criminal enterprise. The first file was a spreadsheet titled Vendor Reconciliation 2020-2025 that laid out every fraudulent transaction in precise detail. 7 shell companies, 43 separate payments, dates ranging from Marcus's first month at Henderson and Associates to just 3 weeks before the wedding. The total amount was staggering $4.7 million over 5 years, all of it flowing through fake vendors and eventually cycling back to accounts Marcus controlled. This is prosecutorial gold, Helen said, her voice tight with controlled excitement. Every transaction documented, every payment traced. A first-year prosecutor could get a conviction with this. The second folder contained email correspondence that was even more damning. In one exchange from 18 months ago, Marcus explicitly instructed Rachel to approve a $300,000 payment to Summit Technologies, writing, "Don't ask questions, just sign it. This is how business works at this level. Your job is to trust me and execute what I tell you." Rachel's response had been a simple, "Okay, processing now." But it was another email chain from 3 months ago that made my hands shake as I read it. The subject line was personnel issues, and it was an exchange between Marcus and someone whose email signature identified him as Marcus's personal attorney. Marcus had written, "We have an employee who's becoming a problem. Emily Carter, project coordinator. She's asking too many questions about vendor relationships and flagging budget discrepancies. I need her managed before she stumbles onto something that creates complications. What are my options?" The attorney's response outlined several strategies for building a termination case, including manufacturing performance issues and creating a paper trail of supposed incompetence. The final message in the chain, sent just 5 days before the wedding, was from Marcus to Rachel. "Handle the annoying employees this weekend. Make an example. Emily is first on the list. Show everyone what happens when people don't stay in their lane." "He planned it," I said, my voice hollow. "The wedding firing wasn't Rachel losing her temper. He ordered her to do it." "Which makes her both a perpetrator and a victim," Helen observed. "She followed his orders, but under coercion and manipulation." The chairman had been silent, reading through the documents with an expression that grew darker with each page. Now he opened the final folder on the flash drive, one labeled simply Family History. Inside were documents that made the scope of Marcus's calculated cruelty fully apparent. There were private investigator reports on my family dating back 3 years, long before Marcus had even met Rachel. The reports detailed my parents' social connections, their financial status, their standing in the community. They identified my mother by her maiden name Sarah Chen and included a highlighted note. Subject filed sexual harassment complaint against Gerald Whitfield in 1994, contributing to his forced resignation from Henderson and Associates. Another document was a printout of an email Marcus had sent to his father 2.5 years ago. "I've identified an opportunity to settle an old score. The Chen woman who destroyed your career has 2 daughters. The older one, Rachel, is unmarried and vulnerable to the right approach. If I marry into that family, I can destroy them from the inside, just like they destroyed us. Poetic justice, don't you think?" His father's response was chilling in its brevity. "Make them pay, whatever it takes." "He married Rachel as revenge," I said, the full horror of it sinking in. "He targeted our family, deliberately seduced my sister, integrated himself into our lives, all so he could eventually tear everything apart. This wasn't just fraud. This was a multi-year vendetta." The chairman's jaw was clenched so tightly I could see the muscles working. Gerald Whitfield wasn't just forced out for harassment. He was embezzling money too, using the same shell company tactics his son learned from him. We kept that quiet to avoid a bigger scandal, but clearly Marcus knew. He spent years preparing to do the same thing using a better position and more sophisticated methods. He looked at me directly. Your mother's courage in 1994 stopped a corrupt man and likely saved this company from much worse damage. And Marcus Whitfield has spent the last 3 years trying to punish your family for that act of integrity. Helen had been taking notes throughout, and now she closed her laptop with an air of finality. We have everything we need. Multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, and obstruction. The revenge angle establishes premeditation and shows this was organized criminal activity, not just poor business judgment. Marcus Whitfield is going to prison for a very long time. My phone buzzed with a message from Margaret Harrison. Chairman, the board has reached a decision. They want to move forward with a full employee disclosure. Town hall meeting scheduled for tomorrow 3 p.m., all staff required to attend. They believe, and I quote, "Truth needs witnesses." The chairman read the message over my shoulder and nodded slowly. They're right. We've kept this investigation quiet for weeks while gathering evidence, but our employees deserve to know what happened in their company. They deserve to understand why their CEO is being removed and what we're doing to prevent this from happening again. He stood his expression resolute. Tomorrow at 3 p.m., we tell them everything. The auditorium at Henderson and Associates headquarters could hold 500 people, and by 3 p.m. the next day, every seat was filled. Employees packed the aisles, lined the back wall, and crowded around the doorways. The mandatory nature of the town hall had sparked intense speculation throughout the building all day, whispers in break rooms, and hurried conversations in hallways about what announcement could possibly require every single employee's presence. I sat in the front row beside Helen, my stomach churning with anxiety. Behind me, I could feel the weight of 400 pairs of eyes, 400 people waiting to hear why their CEO had been suspended, why the company they worked for had been turned upside down over the past month. Some of them had sent me messages of support. Others I knew blamed me for the chaos. All of them deserved to finally understand what had really happened. Chairman Mitchell stood at the podium, flanked by the full board of directors seated in chairs arranged across the stage. His presence commanded immediate silence, the low murmur of conversation dying away as he adjusted the microphone. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice steady and authoritative. "I know the past few weeks have been difficult and confusing. You've seen your CEO suspended, heard rumors about investigations, and watched your company become the subject of national media attention. You deserve answers, and today you're going to get them." He paused, letting his words settle over the room. "We've uncovered serious misconduct at the highest levels of this organization. Financial fraud, embezzlement, abuse of power, and deliberate obstruction of justice. The investigation has been thoroughly conducted by independent forensic auditors and overseen directly by this board. What we've found is deeply troubling, but I believe transparency is the only way forward. You deserve to know the truth about what happened in your company." For the next 20 minutes, Chairman Mitchell presented a carefully prepared summary of the findings. He outlined the fraudulent vendor payments without naming specific amounts, described the shell company scheme without delving into technical details, and explained how multiple employees had been intimidated or coerced into silence. He spoke about the culture of fear that had been deliberately cultivated, about the retaliation against those who asked questions, about the systematic abuse of trust that had infected Henderson and Associates under Marcus Whitfield's leadership. The room was absolutely silent. I could hear people shifting in their seats, could sense the shock rippling through the audience as they understood the full scope of what had been happening while they went about their daily work. "Based on these findings," the chairman continued, "the board of directors has voted unanimously to terminate Marcus Whitfield's employment for cause effective immediately. We are also referring this matter to federal prosecutors for criminal investigation. The evidence we've gathered suggests multiple felonies, and we believe justice requires full accountability." A murmur ran through the crowd, some gasps, a few quiet expressions of satisfaction. The chairman raised his hand for silence. "I also want to address the role of Rachel Carter Whitfield in these events. Ms. Carter Whitfield approved payments that were fraudulent and that cannot be excused. However, our investigation has revealed that she was subjected to psychological abuse, coercion, and threats that significantly impacted her decision-making. She was in many ways a victim of the same manipulative behavior that harmed others in this organization. He glanced toward a document in front of him. Ms. Carter Whitfield has received a formal reprimand and has resigned from her position as Vice President of Operations. However, given her circumstances, including her pregnancy and the recognition that she was operating under duress, the board is offering her access to job retraining programs and support services as she rebuilds her life. I hadn't known about Rachel's resignation until that moment. The news hit me with unexpected force. My sister's career, which she'd spent 7 years building, was over. But perhaps it needed to be for her to truly escape Marcus's influence and start fresh. Chairman Mitchell was preparing to continue when Patricia Oakes, the distinguished board member who'd questioned me so sharply during my first testimony, stood up from her seat on the stage. Her movement was sudden enough to draw everyone's attention, and the chairman paused, giving her a questioning look. "Theodore, may I?" Her voice carried across the auditorium, and though it was steady, I could hear something trembling beneath the surface. "Of course, Patricia." She stepped to the microphone, and I saw that her hands were shaking slightly as she gripped the podium. She was in her early 60s, always impeccably dressed, and composed, a woman who'd spent decades in boardrooms maintaining perfect professional control. But now, facing 400 employees, her composure was cracking. "I need to confess something," she began, and the auditorium grew even quieter if that was possible. "For the past few weeks, someone has been sending anonymous emails to Emily Carter. Tips about where to find evidence, which documents to examine, which trails to follow. Those emails came from me." The revelation sent a shock through the room. I heard gasps behind me, felt my own heart skip a beat. Patricia Oakes had been my anonymous helper, the person who'd been feeding me information, guiding the investigation from the shadows. I used encrypted email services and routing protocols to hide my identity because I was afraid. Afraid of retaliation, afraid of what it would cost me professionally to come forward. But mostly I was afraid of reliving a pain I've carried for 15 years. Her voice broke slightly, and she took a moment to steady herself. 15 years ago, Marcus Whitfield worked at a financial services company where my daughter Jennifer was a junior analyst. She was 24 years old, brilliant, full of promise and optimism about her career. The auditorium was so silent I could hear my own breathing. Patricia's hands gripped the podium tighter, her knuckles white. "Marcus did to her what he did to others here. He manipulated her, isolated her, made her feel like her career depended on his approval. When she tried to report his behavior, he threatened to destroy her professionally. The pressure, the fear, the feeling of being trapped, it became too much for her to bear." Patricia's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but the microphone carried her words to every corner of the room. She took her own life. The weight of Patricia Oakes's confession settled over the auditorium like a heavy blanket. Several employees were openly crying. Others sat frozen in their seats, stunned by the revelation that Marcus Whitfield's pattern of abuse had claimed a life years before he'd ever set foot in Henderson and Associates. Patricia remained at the podium, tears streaming down her face, but her voice grew stronger as she continued. Jennifer worked at Whitfield Financial Services, where Marcus was a senior vice president. She came to me 6 months into her job telling me something was wrong, that her boss made her uncomfortable, that he was controlling and manipulative. I told her what so many parents tell their daughters, to be professional, to not make waves, to focus on her career. I didn't understand the severity of what was happening until it was too late. She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, not caring that her carefully applied makeup was smearing. After Jennifer died, I investigated. I found 3 other women at that company who'd experienced the same treatment from Marcus. All of them had been too afraid to report it. All of them carried guilt and trauma. I made it my mission to never let him hurt anyone else. When he was hired as CEO here 2 years ago, I was already on this board. I voted against his appointment, but I was outvoted. So I waited. I watched. I documented everything I could access. And when Emily Carter filed her complaint when she showed the courage my daughter couldn't find, and the courage I failed to support, I knew this was the moment to act. She turned to look directly at me, her expression a mixture of gratitude and grief. Emily, you gave me the chance to finally hold him accountable for what he took from my family. Every email I sent you was a step toward justice for Jennifer. Thank you for being brave enough to see this through. I couldn't speak. My throat was too tight with emotion. I could only nod, acknowledging her words while my mind reeled with the understanding that my fight had been part of something much larger, a chain of pain and resistance stretching back years. Chairman Mitchell returned to the podium, placing a supportive hand briefly on Patricia's shoulder before she returned to her seat. What Patricia has shared with us today is both a tragedy and a testament to why this investigation matters. Marcus Whitfield's pattern of abuse didn't start here, and if we hadn't stopped it, it wouldn't have ended here either. He picked up a document from the podium, his expression grave. The board has reached several decisions that we're announcing today. First, Marcus Whitfield's employment is terminated for cause. Per the terms of his contract, termination for cause means immediate forfeiture of all unvested stock options, bonuses, and severance payments. We are also initiating clawback provisions to recover compensation paid during the period when fraudulent activities were occurring. Additionally, we have referred this matter to the U.S. Attorney's Office for criminal prosecution. The charges will include wire fraud, embezzlement, money laundering, and obstruction of justice. A surge of satisfaction moved through me, hearing the concrete consequences finally articulated. This wasn't just Marcus losing his job. This was complete professional destruction and the promise of criminal accountability. Furthermore, the chairman continued, we are cooperating with several civil attorneys representing victims of Mr. Whitfield's harassment and abuse at previous companies. Those individuals will have the opportunity to pursue damages, and this company will support their efforts with relevant documentation and testimony. He set down the document and looked out over the assembled employees. But holding one person accountable is not enough. We need to rebuild trust in this organization. We need leadership that embodies integrity, that puts people before profit, that creates a culture where speaking up is rewarded rather than punished. He paused, and his eyes found mine in the front row. Emily Carter has demonstrated exactly those qualities over these past weeks. She sacrificed her family relationships, endured public scrutiny, and never wavered in her commitment to doing what was right. Therefore, the board is offering Ms. Carter the position of Interim Chief Operating Officer, effective immediately. The announcement caught me completely off guard. Several employees began applauding, and within seconds, the entire auditorium was on its feet, 400 people clapping and some even cheering. I sat frozen, overwhelmed by the gesture, and terrified by the responsibility it represented. Chairman Mitchell waited for the applause to die down before continuing. We're also establishing a new program called the Jennifer Oaks Fellowship, named in honor of Patricia's daughter. This program will provide support counseling and legal assistance to any employee who experiences harassment or abuse in the workplace. We're committing $1 million annually to ensure that no one at this company ever feels as alone and trapped as Jennifer did. More applause this time, accompanied by visible emotion from many in the audience. Patricia Oaks was crying openly now, but these were different tears. Tears of relief, of recognition of a daughter's memory, being honored in a way that might prevent future tragedies. Finally, the chairman said, regarding Rachel Carter Whitfield. As I mentioned, she has resigned from her position and received a formal reprimand. However, the board recognizes that she was victimized by Marcus Whitfield's manipulation and coercion. We're offering her enrollment in our executive retraining program, which will help her develop new professional skills. Additionally, we're providing financial support for legal fees related to her divorce proceedings and establishing a child care fund to support her and her child during this transition. The meeting continued for another 30 minutes, with various board members addressing questions from employees and outlining the steps being taken to prevent future misconduct. By the time Chairman Mitchell concluded with a call for unity and healing, I felt emotionally wrung out, barely able to process everything that had happened. as employees began filing out of the auditorium, still talking in hushed, intense voices about what they'd heard. The chairman approached me. "Emily, could you stay for a moment? There's something we need to discuss privately." Helen gave my arm a supportive squeeze before leaving with the others. Soon the auditorium was empty except for me and Chairman Mitchell, the vast space feeling cavernous and quiet after the intensity of the past hour. He sat down in the chair beside mine, suddenly looking older and more tired than I'd seen him before. "There's something about your mother you need to know. Something I should have told you weeks ago, but I wasn't sure how or when. After what Patricia shared today, after everything that's come out, I think you deserve the complete truth about what happened in 1994, and why I've been so personally invested in protecting you through this investigation." The chairman reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. I recognized the same one that had contained the photograph he'd shown me weeks ago. He opened it carefully, handling the contents with the reverence of someone touching sacred artifacts, and withdrew the full version of that image. This print was larger than the one I'd seen before, showing the complete scene without cropping. It had been taken at what looked like a company celebration, perhaps a holiday party or anniversary event. A banner in the background read, "Henderson & Associates 1994 Summer Gala." About 15 people were arranged in a semi-formal group pose, drinks in hand, forced smiles on most faces. Gerald Whitfield stood in the center, commanding attention even in a decades-old photograph. He was a large man, confident and imposing, with the same angular features I recognized from Marcus. To his right stood a much younger Theodore Mitchell, perhaps in his mid-30s, uncomfortable in a suit that looked slightly too formal for his frame. And there, positioned between them but slightly behind, was my mother at 25 years old. She wore a conservative business suit, and her dark hair was pulled back severely. But it was her expression that broke my heart. A careful blankness that I now recognized as the mask women wear when they're trying to be invisible, trying not to attract attention, trying to survive a situation they can't escape. Both Gerald Whitfield and Theodore Mitchell had their hands on her shoulders, posed as if they were all colleagues sharing a friendly moment. But looking at my mother's face, at the tension in her jaw and the fear barely concealed in her eyes, I knew there was nothing friendly about that moment. "June 15th, 1994, Chairman Mitchell said quietly. "The company's annual summer gala at the Riverside Hotel. The same hotel where your sister had her wedding, though I don't think Marcus chose that venue by coincidence." He pointed to my mother in the photograph. "Your mother, Sarah Chen, had been with Henderson & Associates for 3 years. She was brilliant, one of the most promising junior associates we'd ever hired. Everyone expected her to make senior partner within a decade." "What happened that night?" "I witnessed it, though I'm ashamed to say I didn't fully understand what I was seeing at the time. Gerald Whitfield had been drinking heavily throughout the evening. He cornered your mother near the bar, made comments about her appearance, put his hands on her in ways that were clearly unwanted. When she tried to move away, he followed her. I saw her face. She looked terrified but was trying not to show it, trying to remain professional." He paused, his expression pained. "I was young, ambitious, and Gerald was one of the most powerful executives in the company. I told myself it wasn't my business, that I must have been misreading the situation, that surely someone more senior would intervene if something was really wrong." The self-recrimination in his voice was raw even after 3 decades. But no one intervened. And it wasn't just that night. Over the following weeks, your mother tried to avoid Gerald, but he made it nearly impossible. He found reasons to keep her late at the office, assigned her to projects that required one-on-one meetings with him, made increasingly inappropriate comments. Other employees noticed but looked away. That was the culture then. Harassment was considered a personal problem, not a corporate issue. How did it end? Your mother did what very few women had the courage to do in 1994. She documented everything, kept a detailed log of every incident, every witness, every time and place. Then she filed a formal complaint with HR. He pulled another document from the folder, a typewritten form on Henderson & Associates letterhead dated July 1994. The company tried to dismiss it at first. Gerald was too valuable, too connected, and your mother was just a junior associate. They offered her money to withdraw the complaint and sign a confidentiality agreement. She refused. She refused. And when she refused, they tried to destroy her professionally. They gave her impossible assignments designed to make her fail, excluded her from important meetings, spread rumors that she was difficult to work with. But your mother kept her documentation, added the retaliation to her complaint, and eventually, her evidence became too substantial to ignore. He looked at me directly. Me. I finally found my courage then. I went to the board. This was before I was chairman. I was just a junior member, and I told them what I'd witnessed at the gala. Several other employees came forward too once they saw someone was actually taking the complaint seriously. The investigation became unavoidable. And Gerald was forced out. He was forced to retire in exchange for the company not pursuing criminal charges and not making the details of the investigation public. He got to keep his pension, preserve some dignity, but his career was over. He was bitter, vengeful, and apparently he passed that resentment on to his son. Chairman Mitchell's voice hardened. Marcus grew up hearing about how his father was destroyed by a vindictive woman, how the Chen family ruined their lives. He built his entire career with the goal of getting revenge, of infiltrating this company and destroying it from within, just as he believed your mother had destroyed his father. The calculated nature of Marcus's vendetta made me feel sick. And my mother? What happened to her? She left Henderson and Associates a few months after Gerald's departure. The retaliation had taken its toll, and despite our best efforts, the stigma of being the woman who filed the complaint followed her. She found work elsewhere, eventually left corporate life entirely. But she'd done something incredibly important. She'd established that even powerful men could be held accountable. The investigation prompted policy changes across the industry. Other women started coming forward with their own stories. Your mother's courage had ripples that extended far beyond her own case. He reached into the folder one final time and withdrew a sealed envelope yellowed with age. My mother's name was written on the front in her own handwriting, and across the seal was stamped, Henderson and Associates, Human Resources Confidential. Your mother wrote this letter to HR 30 years ago as part of her formal complaint. It details everything that happened, not just the facts, but how it made her feel, what it cost her professionally and personally. The official investigation files were destroyed after the settlement per the agreement. But I kept a copy of this letter. His voice was thick with emotion. I kept it because I never wanted to forget what my silence had cost, what it took for your mother to find her voice when the rest of us had lost ours. And I kept it because I knew someday it might matter again. He handed me the envelope, and I felt the weight of 3 decades of history in my hands. Your mother would want you to have this now. She'd want you to know that the courage you showed these past weeks isn't just your own, it's a legacy she gave you. When I saw you standing in that ballroom at the wedding, humiliated in front of hundreds of people but refusing to break, I saw her. I saw the same strength, the same refusal to accept injustice, the same willingness to pay whatever price integrity demands. I sat alone in the empty auditorium holding my mother's letter, afraid to open it, but unable to set it down. The chairman had left me with privacy, understanding that some moments need to be experienced in solitude. The envelope's seal was brittle with age, and when I finally worked up the courage to break it, the paper inside was thin and slightly yellowed, covered in my mother's careful handwriting. Reading her words from 30 years ago felt like listening to her voice across time. She described the fear, the shame, the constant calculation of whether speaking up would cost her more than staying silent. She wrote about feeling trapped between protecting her career and protecting her dignity, about the weight of knowing that her silence would only empower Gerald Whitfield to hurt others. By the final page, I was crying, understanding for the first time the full cost of the courage she'd shown. I was still sitting there when my phone buzzed with a text from my mother's number, the first direct communication I'd received from her in weeks. Your father and I would like to talk. Can we meet tomorrow, Riverside Park, the bench by the duck pond? 10 a.m. Please. The formality of the message, the careful politeness told me everything about how uncertain they were of my response. I could have ignored it, could have made them wait the way they'd made me feel abandoned. But reading my mother's letter had reminded me that courage sometimes means choosing connection, even when it's painful. I arrived at the park 10 minutes early the next morning, needing time to prepare myself emotionally for whatever was about to happen. The bench by the duck pond had been a favorite spot during my childhood, a place where my father would bring Rachel and me to feed the ducks on Sunday afternoons. The memory of those simpler times made what had happened between us feel even more tragic. My parents arrived exactly at 10, walking slowly across the grass like people approaching something they both needed and feared. They looked older than I remembered, more worn. My father's face had new lines around his eyes and mouth, and his shoulders carried a heaviness that hadn't been there before. My mother's hair seemed grayer, and she moved with a careful fragility that spoke of sleepless nights and emotional exhaustion. We sat on the bench in awkward silence for a moment, the three of us staring at the pond where a family of ducks paddled peacefully, oblivious to human complications. Finally, my father spoke, and his voice broke on the first word. "We were wrong." He cleared his throat, tried again. "Emily, your mother and I were wrong. About everything. About how we handled the wedding, about demanding you apologize, about choosing appearances over protecting you. We cared more about how things looked than about whether they were right. We cared more about preserving an image than about preserving our family." My mother reached over and took my hand, her grip trembling. "I saw that photograph," she said quietly. "When the chairman showed it at the board meeting last week when he talked about what happened in 1994. I recognized Gerald Whitfield immediately. I knew exactly who Marcus's father was, and I finally understood what had really been happening." "You knew Marcus's connection to Gerald and you never said anything." I was ashamed and afraid. Tears slid down her cheeks. "When your father first introduced Rachel to Marcus, I thought the name Whitfield sounded familiar, but I convinced myself it was just a common name, that there couldn't possibly be a connection. Then, at the engagement party when I met Marcus's father at that reception, I knew. I saw Gerald across the room, and every memory from 1994 came flooding back. The fear, the humiliation, the price I paid for standing up to him. "Why didn't you warn Rachel?" "Because I was a coward." Her voice broke completely. "I told myself that Marcus wasn't his father, that it wasn't fair to judge him for his father's sins. But the truth is, I was afraid of reliving that whole nightmare of having to explain to your father and Rachel why I'd left Henderson and Associates, of admitting that the reason I'd left corporate life wasn't just about wanting to focus on family like I'd always claimed. I stayed silent, and my silence put Rachel in danger." My father pulled out a handkerchief and wiped his eyes roughly. "And I made everything worse by pushing that connection, by bragging about the match I'd made, by wrapping my ego up in Rachel's marriage to a successful CEO. When you tried to tell us something was wrong, when you raised concerns about Marcus, I dismissed you because admitting you were right meant admitting my judgment had failed." The honesty in their admissions, the rawness of their accountability, was something I'd never expected to hear. These were my parents, the people who'd always presented themselves as having all the answers, and here they were acknowledging that they'd been devastatingly wrong. "I'm glad you understand that now," I said carefully. "But understanding isn't enough. If we're going to rebuild any kind of relationship, things have to change fundamentally. I need to know that you're committed to doing the work, not just saying the words." My mother nodded vigorously. "Whatever you need, whatever it takes." "Then I have 3 conditions." I took a breath, steadying myself. 1, you respect my boundaries. That means if I say I need space, you give it to me. If I make a decision you disagree with, you state your opinion once and then accept that it's my life to live. No more demands, no more ultimatums, no more emotional manipulation." My father looked pained but nodded. "Agreed." 2, no interference in my life decisions. My career, my relationships, where I live, how I spend my time, those are mine to control. You can offer advice if I ask for it, but you don't get to dictate or pressure or use guilt to get your way. "We understand," my mother said softly. 3, family therapy. all of us together with a professional who can help us work through the patterns that led us here. This isn't going to be fixed by one conversation. We need help learning how to be a family that actually supports each other instead of just maintaining appearances." My parents exchanged a glance, and I saw my father's jaw work as he swallowed his pride. Family therapy would mean admitting to an outsider that the perfect Carter family image was a lie. But after a long moment, he nodded. "If that's what it takes to have our daughter back, then yes, we'll do therapy." We sat together for a while longer, talking carefully about next steps, about how to move forward, about Rachel and the baby, and the complicated process of healing that lay ahead for all of us. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, too much had been broken for that, but it felt like a beginning. As we stood to leave, my father touched my arm gently. "There's something else you need to know. Marcus filed a defamation lawsuit against you yesterday. His lawyers served papers to Helen's office. He's claiming that your statements to the board and the media have damaged his reputation and cost him future employment opportunities." His expression was grim. "He's asking for $5 million in damages. He's not going quietly, Emily. He's going to fight this every step of the way." The defamation lawsuit arrived as a thick stack of legal documents delivered to Helen's office on a Friday afternoon. Marcus's attorneys had crafted 43 pages of accusations, claiming that my statements to the board, my cooperation with investigators, and my role in the public disclosure had destroyed his reputation and rendered him unemployable in his field. They argued that I had acted with malice, that I had deliberately sought to ruin him out of personal vendetta, and that the $5 million in damages they were seeking barely scratched the surface of the harm I'd caused. Helen read through the complaint with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen countless frivolous lawsuits, then set it down with a dismissive snort. "This won't survive a motion to dismiss. Truth is an absolute defense against defamation. Everything you said about Marcus was supported by documented evidence. His lawyers know this is going nowhere, but they're filing it anyway to intimidate you and drain your resources." She was right. Within 6 weeks, Judge Margaret Harrison, no relation to the chairman's assistant, issued a ruling dismissing the defamation suit with prejudice, meaning Marcus couldn't refile it. Her written opinion was scathing, noting that the plaintiff had failed to identify a single false statement, and that his claim of reputational harm was undermined by the fact that his reputation accurately reflected his documented criminal behavior. But while the civil suit died quickly, the criminal case ground forward with the slow, inexorable momentum of the federal justice system. Marcus hired a team of high-powered defense attorneys who employed every legal tactic available to delay proceedings. They filed motions to suppress evidence, challenged the validity of search warrants, argued that the forensic audit had been conducted improperly, and demanded that various witnesses be excluded from testimony. I spent countless hours working with the prosecutors, 2 serious young attorneys named David Chen and Sarah Williams, who treated the case with the gravity it deserved. They prepared me for depositions, walked me through the evidence, and helped me understand the complex legal framework that would govern the trial if it came to that. The deposition process was grueling. Marcus's defense attorneys, led by a silver-haired lawyer named Richard Castellano, who charged $800 an hour, spent 3 full days questioning me about every aspect of my employment at Henderson & Associates, my relationship with Rachel, my motivations for reporting the fraud, and my communications with the chairman and board members. Castellano was skilled at making innocent actions sound suspicious, at twisting straightforward answers into apparent contradictions, at wearing down witnesses through sheer persistence. "Ms. Carter, isn't it true that you harbored resentment toward your sister for years before this incident?" he asked during hour 7 of my second deposition day. "I had complicated feelings about family dynamics, yes, but that has nothing to do with the documented financial fraud." "Complicated feelings? Can you elaborate on those complicated feelings?" Helen, sitting beside me, interjected. "Asked and answered. Move on, counselor." It went on like that for hours, then days, then weeks. Other witnesses faced similar treatment. Frank Morrison, the accountant, who'd first tipped me off to invoice 1187, endured a deposition where Castellano suggested he'd fabricated evidence out of professional jealousy. Martha Reynolds. Marcus's former secretary was questioned aggressively about her motivations and her own role in processing fraudulent payments at his previous company. The media attention made everything worse. Every court filing became a news story, every motion hearing drew reporters. My face was now recognizable enough that I couldn't go to the grocery store without someone stopping me to ask questions or offer unsolicited opinions about the case. Some people treated me like a hero. Others accused me of destroying a family for personal gain. The constant scrutiny was exhausting in ways I hadn't anticipated. The turning point came 4 months into the proceedings, when prosecutors filed a motion to admit testimony about Patricia Oakes's daughter as evidence of prior bad acts. Marcus's attorneys fought fiercely against this, arguing that events from 15 years ago at a different company were irrelevant and prejudicial. But Judge Harrison ruled in the prosecution's favor, determining that the pattern of behavior was directly relevant to understanding Marcus's character and modus operandi. The defendant's alleged conduct toward Jennifer Oakes shows a consistent pattern of manipulation, harassment, and retaliation that is substantially similar to the charges in this case, Judge Harrison wrote in her ruling. This is not mere character evidence, but rather proof of a deliberate and practiced method of operation. With that ruling, Marcus's defense strategy collapsed. Castellano requested a private meeting with prosecutors, and within a week, they were negotiating a plea agreement. Marcus would plead guilty to wire fraud, embezzlement, and obstruction of justice in exchange for the prosecution dropping several other charges and recommending a sentence on the lower end of federal guidelines. The plea hearing took place on a cold morning in January, exactly 7 months after Rachel's wedding. The courtroom was packed with reporters, Henderson and Associates employees, and people whose lives Marcus had touched over the years. Patricia Oakes sat in the front row, her daughter's photograph in a locket around her neck. Rachel was there too, visibly pregnant now, sitting with our parents in the back. Marcus stood before the judge in an expensive suit that couldn't hide how much the past months had diminished him. His voice was flat as he answered Judge Harrison's questions, admitting his guilt with the minimum words required by law, showing no remorse or accountability beyond what his plea agreement demanded. Do you understand that by entering this plea, you are admitting to defrauding Henderson and Associates of approximately $4.7 million over a 5-year period? Judge Harrison asked. Yes, Your Honor. And do you understand that you are admitting to obstructing justice by deleting evidence and intimidating witnesses? Yes, Your Honor. The judge accepted the plea, then set a sentencing hearing for 6 months later. Those 6 months passed in a strange limbo, a period of waiting, while the prosecutors compiled victim impact statements and Marcus's attorneys prepared arguments for leniency based on his lack of prior criminal record and his cooperation with the investigation. Finally, on a humid morning in July, almost exactly 1 year after the wedding that had started, we returned to Judge Harrison's courtroom for sentencing. She had reviewed all the materials, heard arguments from both sides, and considered letters from dozens of people Marcus had harmed over the years. When she finally spoke, her voice was firm and clear. Mr. Whitfield, you abused positions of trust, manipulated vulnerable people, and caused immeasurable harm over many years. The sentence of this court is 18 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. You are ordered to pay $4.7 million in restitution to Henderson and Associates and its affected employees. Additionally, you are permanently barred from serving as an officer or director of any publicly traded company. 6 months after Marcus's sentencing, on a bright October morning, Rachel called to tell me she was in labor. I drove to the hospital through autumn leaves falling like confetti, arriving just in time to meet my niece, a tiny, perfect girl with Rachel's dark hair and a cry that filled the delivery room with surprising strength. Her name is Sarah, Rachel told me, tears streaming down her face as she held her daughter. After Mom. After someone who knew how to be brave when it mattered. Rachel had moved into a modest two-bedroom apartment across town, furnished simply with second-hand pieces and hand-me-downs that felt more like home than the sterile perfection of the house she'd shared with Marcus. She was working part-time at a non-profit that helped women rebuild their careers after leaving abusive relationships, using her own experience to guide others through similar journeys. Every Tuesday evening, she attended therapy sessions that were helping her untangle years of manipulation and rediscover who she was beneath the person Marcus had tried to make her become. Our relationship was still complicated, still healing, but we were learning to be sisters again. I was Auntie Emily now, the person Rachel called when Sarah wouldn't stop crying at 3 a.m, the one who brought groceries when money was tight, the family member who showed up without judgment or demands. My parents had kept their promise about family therapy. Every other week, the four of us sat in Dr. Chen's office working through decades of dysfunction, learning to communicate honestly instead of performing perfection. My father had joined a men's group at his church that focused on toxic masculinity and the damage pride can inflict on families. He spoke less than he used to, listened more, and was learning that strength sometimes means admitting weakness. My mother had started volunteering at a women's shelter, using her own story from 1994 to help current victims understand they weren't alone. She'd stopped dyeing her gray hair, stopped worrying quite so much about what the neighbors thought, and was discovering a version of herself that felt more authentic than the careful persona she'd maintained for decades. When we gathered for baby Sarah's christening in a small chapel, it felt nothing like Rachel's wedding. There were only 20 people present, mostly close family and a few genuine friends. No designer dresses or elaborate flowers, just simple joy and gratitude for new life and second chances. That evening, I stood on the balcony of my own apartment, watching the sun set over the city. Inside, my laptop sat open to the video file I'd kept from the wedding. I'd watched it occasionally over the past year, sometimes with anger, sometimes with sadness, using it to remind myself why the fight had mattered. But tonight, I played it one final time, watched myself stand frozen in that ballroom while my world collapsed, watched Rachel kneel and the chairman's voice cut through the chaos. Then I deleted it. Not out of denial or avoidance, but because I didn't need it anymore. The lessons were learned, the wisdom earned, and holding on to the recording was just holding on to pain I no longer needed to carry. Dr. Chen had told me something in one of our sessions that had stayed with me. Forgiveness is a door, but boundaries are the lock. You can open the door and allow people back into your life, but you hold the key to the lock. You decide who gets in and under what conditions. I'd learned to use both. The door stayed open for my parents, for Rachel, for anyone willing to walk through it with genuine respect and accountability. But I held the key and I decided the terms. Some doors opened wide, others opened just a crack, and some stayed closed completely, not out of cruelty, but out of self-preservation. On Monday morning, I arrived at Henderson & Associates as Chief Operating Officer, a role that had become permanent 3 months earlier. A young woman named Jessica was waiting outside my office, looking nervous and clutching a folder to her chest. "Ms. Carter, I'm sorry to bother you, but I need to report something. My supervisor has been pressuring me to approve expenses that don't seem legitimate, and when I questioned them, he told me to stop making trouble." Her voice shook slightly. "I know it could cost me my job, but I think something wrong is happening, and I don't know what else to do." I gestured for her to sit down, saw myself in her frightened eyes, and smiled gently. "You did exactly the right thing reporting this. Let me tell you a story about standing up for what's right, even when it costs you everything you thought you couldn't afford to lose." And that's my story, from being fired in front of 200 wedding guests, to becoming COO, from family betrayal, to slow but genuine reconciliation. This journey taught me that doing what's right is never easy, but it's always worth it. It taught me that boundaries aren't walls that separate us, but bridges with gates, and you decide who crosses and under what conditions. If this story touched your heart, if it made you think about the boundaries in your own life, please subscribe to this channel for more stories about courage, justice, and the journey to reclaim yourself. And I really want to hear from you. Do you agree with the decisions I made? If you were in my position, how would you have handled it? Have you ever had to choose between family and your principles? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone else facing a similar difficult choice. What would you have done differently? Would you have pursued justice or protected family peace? I'm genuinely curious about your perspective, and your comment could help others who are struggling with these impossible decisions right now. Thank you for listening. And remember, courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing the right thing even when your hands are shaking.